Hey guys, tonight we drift down an old desert road, one that hums softly under your sandals, as if remembering every footstep that ever crossed it. The stars overhead shimmer above cliffs painted the color of sunset itself, rose red rust gold. You're standing before Petra, the Nabataean capital, carved from sandstone like a dream that refused to fade. You probably won't survive this place, not because of danger, but because once it gets into your imagination, it never lets go. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening somewhere far away, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where this little night caravan reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past columns, half swallowed by sand. The air smells faintly of dust and sage. The cliffs around you rise like sleeping giants, their bellies hollowed into halls where traders once stored gold incense and gossip. Petra, rose-red city, half as old as time, as the poet said didn't start as an empire's capital. It began as a smart parking lot, a stopover where Nabataean nomads could water camels, stash goods, and catch some shade before facing the next 200 miles of nothing. The Nabataeans were masters of the in-between. They didn't farm much. They didn't conquer much. They connected. Imagine this 3rd century BCE. Spices from Yemen, pearls from the Gulf Myrrh, from Oman, all crawling northward through heat waves and mirage bound for the hungry markets of Rome, Greece, and Egypt. Every caravan had to cross the Arabian plateau, and sooner or later they needed water rest and a safe deal. That's where Petra rose, an improbable oasis ringed by cliffs like fortress walls. Even by flashlight, or let's be honest, the flashlight on your phone, the rock looks almost alive. The color shifts from pale peach at dawn to deep crimson by dusk. Every step echoes, and the silence hums like a waiting breath. Archaeologists found the earliest Nabataean settlements around here around the 6th century BCE. No big palaces, no throne rooms, just smart water channels carved into stone and small shrines tucked beside cistern mouths. They were setting up for the long game. You imagine the first traders tracing camel tracks in the sand, tying rope to rope, connecting watering holes into what would become one of the most profitable logistical networks of the ancient world. The Nabataeans had no written manifesto, no grand declarations. Their message was carved in rock and carried by camels. We exist because we connect you. That was their real motto, a mainstream historical fact. Archaeologists agree Petra's earliest monumental phase took shape around the 3rd century BCE, when the Nabataeans began consolidating caravan control between Gaza, Damascus, and the Red Sea port of Luki-Kome. They built not just warehouses, but entire economies around the movement of goods. And each warehouse was like a bank vault, air-cooled, stone-walled, and decorated enough to remind you this wasn't a dusty backroom deal. This was global trade, a fringe tidbit some fringe historians like to suggest the Nabataeans might have learned their water engineering tricks from even earlier Arabian tribes that had contact with Indian Ocean sailors. There's no hard proof, but it's a fun image. Desert folk swapping notes with seafarers under the same blazing sun. You wander deeper between walls streaked like layered cake. A breeze carries the faint whistle of wind through a long, narrow cleft, the sick Petra's iconic entry. The path twists like a serpent before spitting you out before the treasury facade. Its columns glow pale rose in the starlight. You can almost hear the clip-clop of camel hooves echoing through time. Historians still argue whether Petra's warehouses were primarily commercial storage or ritual offerings disguised as trade hubs. Some evidence suggests certain chambers doubled as sanctuaries where incense and grain were symbolically stored for the gods. Others insist these were practical logistics centers, ancient equivalents of free trade zones. Either way, you can picture the scene: torches, flickering scales, weighing frankincense scribes, noting tallies in Nabataean script. And oh, the smell-sweet resin camel sweat, crushed date pits. The kind of scent that says civilization is happening here. You brush your fingers against the cool stone. Even now, the walls bear soot stains from lamps long dead. The air tastes faintly metallic, like old coins. You can almost hear laughter, bargaining, and a few complaints about taxes that never change through history. The Nabataean success lay in subtlety. They didn't force empires to deal with them. They made empires need them. Their roads stitched together the Arabian Peninsula's trade arteries. Rome wanted its incense for funerals and temples. Egypt craved spices and silk. Judea traded for copper and myrrh. And every crate passed through Nabataean hands. You might say they were the ancient world's customs officers, accountants, and delivery service rolled into one. Some nights, when moonlight brushed the cliffs, the warehouses glimmered faintly, as if the stone itself had soaked up centuries of caravan torches. You sit on a boulder, tracing with your finger the ghost of an inscription. It's partly erased, partly preserved. Maybe it says the name of a merchant. Maybe it's a blessing for safe passage. Maybe it's just ancient graffiti. Asha was here. Good luck finding water. You smile. Same humor, different millennium. And as you settle into that thought, you realize something. This rose-red city, carved from nothing but willpower and sandstone, isn't just a relic. It's a record of motion, of people who refuse to stand still, of a civilization that found wealth in emptiness and community in the desert's quietest corners. Somewhere behind you, the desert wind sighs through the canyons, carrying a whisper older than memory. Keep moving. Trade is life. You brush off the sand, and with the sound of your own breath echoing against the stone, you follow the next path toward the wells, the real secret of survival in this endless rose maze. The night deepens as you leave the echoing stone facades behind. The air feels cooler now, though your skin still remembers the heat baked into the sandstone. The path ahead winds downward, toward a basin cut like a half moon in the earth. Somewhere below, a faint trickle of water whispers through channels unseen. You tilt your head. Yes, it's there. A rhythm softer than breath. You're hearing the reason Petra lived longer than most cities, carved from dust, the quiet, stubborn persistence of water. You stop at what looks like a stairway leading into darkness. It isn't a tomb, it's a cistern. The Nabataeans mastered the impossible trick of making the desert bloom, or at least drink. Every drop of rain that kissed these cliffs was captured, guided, stored. When a flash flood tore down a wadi, they turned it into an opportunity, not a disaster. They carved terraces, lined channels with plaster, and dug catchment basins so deep the air inside stayed cool even in midsummer. You imagine one of those long-ago engineers, barefoot, sunburned, probably grumbling, squinting at the horizon and calculating slope angles with a stick. Ancient Math Desert Edition. A mainstream historical fact, archaeologists have mapped an astonishing hydrological network across Petra and its satellite stations, over 200 rock-cut cisterns, hundreds of meters of covered canals, and even clay pipes that fed pools for animals and humans. The city could store millions of liters of water, enough to sustain its population and passing caravans during months of drought. It wasn't luck. It was geometry, gravity, and genius. The sound of your steps changes as you descend into one of these old reservoirs. The air grows damp, tasting faintly of iron and algae. Your voice would echo here, but you keep silent. Something about the acoustics demands reverence. You run your hand along the wall, feeling a line of smooth plaster, still clinging after 2,000 years. Someone mixed that plaster with ash and crushed limestone, then polished it until no drop could seep away. You picture that artisan humming, maybe muttering a prayer, to Dushara, the Nabataean mountain god, or to Al-Uzza, goddess of might and the morning star. A quirky tidbit: traces of fig seeds and date pits have been found at the bottoms of ancient water channels. Some scholars think workers used bits of fruit pulp to test the flow if the seeds floated cleanly through the gradient was perfect. Desert engineers, but with snacks. As you climb back into moonlight, you notice the desert floor gleaming faintly with white mineral crusts, the telltale residue of ancient floods. That's how archaeologists often find lost roots, by reading salt scars and runoff patterns like fingerprints. You start to notice the logic of it all. Wells appear where two wadis intersect. Caravan stations sit just a day's march apart. It's less a landscape than a living map written in stone and thirst. Historians still argue whether the Nabataeans inherited this water mastery from earlier Edomite or Moabite systems, or whether they invented their own techniques through centuries of trial and error. Some evidence suggests borrowed ideas. Others point to sheer Nabataean innovation. Maybe it was both, like any good survival story, equal parts tradition and improvisation. You take a sip from your canteen, modern plastic, not elegant clay, but the act connects you to every traveler who ever stood here. Imagine the relief when a caravan spotted a well after 3 blistering days, camels groaning, men stumbling, and then that glorious shimmer of water. You'd drop everything literally and rush to splash your face, drink until dizzy, maybe even wash your socks if nobody was watching. A low stone wall rises near the path, half buried under sand. Archaeologists call it a guard lip, a raised edge designed to prevent sand from blowing into cistern mouths. The Nabataeans thought of everything. You smile, impressed and slightly jealous that your own kitchen sink sometimes leaks while their system lasted millennia. Farther along, you reach a wider pool, a reflection of stars in an ancient basin. The air cools sharply. The night smells of wet earth and juniper. You crouch, dip your fingers, and find the water cold enough to make you gasp. 2,000 years later, it's still doing its job. Somewhere nearby, a frog croaks. You blink. A frog in Petra. Proof that the Nabataeans didn't just build for trade, they built for life itself. Another sound rises, wind scraping softly through a narrow crevice. You realize it's the same channel that once carried floodwater, You follow it uphill, tracing its path like a detective retracing an ancient crime of ingenuity. The channel leads to a small, rectangular platform overlooking the basin below. From here, you can see how everything connects: cisterns, channels, retaining walls, even the faint line of a caravan track disappearing into the dark. You sit and watch the desert breathe. A breeze rolls over you, carrying that faint mineral tang of evaporating water. You think of the merchants who camped here, tethering their camels near the wells, unpacking bundles wrapped in goat hide. There would be murmurs, laughter, maybe someone cursing when a camel tried to steal dates from the sack. Fires crackled. A storyteller, probably more dramatic than accurate, spun tales of sea monsters off the coast of Yemen. Someone played a reed flute, its notes sliding between melancholy and mischief. They'd sleep with full bellies and easy hearts because the wells were near. Tomorrow's desert could wait. The moon rises higher, silvering every stone ridge. The desert feels almost gentle now, a creature temporarily tamed by the promise of water. You find yourself imagining how each caravan stop must have sounded at night, like a whispering port, without ships, every voice softened by sand. The wells were their harbors, their lighthouses, their safe zones amid the endless horizon. And in a way, they still are. The archaeologists who uncovered these systems often camp beside the same wells, hearing the same wind brushing the same dust from their faces. Technology changes, but thirst never does. You lean back on your elbows, watching the stars ripple faintly in the basin below. Somewhere out there, new satellites glide metal caravans, tracing paths over a planet still mostly desert. Maybe one day someone will study our pipelines and hydration systems with the same awe. They stored water in plastic tubes, they'll say. How quaint. The wind laughs softly through the canyons. You smile because the desert always finds its humor dry, understated, eternal. The wells shimmer one last time before you turn away, following the faint outline of a path toward the city's core. Ahead lies the hum of life and trade, the warehouses where water turned into wealth. Dawn slides down the cliffs like melted copper as you climb toward the cluster of facades that once formed the beating heart of Petra's economy, the warehouses. The air is still cool, carrying a hint of juniper and ash. Behind you, the wells gleam faintly in the fading starlight, a quiet reminder that every grain of spice and ounce of perfume stored here first passed through those cisterns. Ahead, the rock walls rise into shapes that seem both natural and sculpted by divine hands: columns, lintels, niches, carved straight into living stone. You pass under a half-broken archway and step into a cavern wide enough to fit a small aircraft hangar. But instead of machines, imagine rows upon rows of amphorae clay jars sealed with resin filled with olive oil, frankincense, myrrh, or sometimes water laced with wine for the elite. The air back then must have been thick with scent, sweet resin, fermented dates, and the faint musk of camel leather. You can almost taste the humidity that would rise from the floor after a day of desert heat. The Nabataeans didn't just build storage, they built systems. Each chamber had specific temperature control thanks to natural insulation. The positioning of openings allowed air to circulate, but kept out the worst of the heat. And some narrow shafts channeled wind from above, cooling the interiors like early air conditioning. A mainstream historical fact: these were among the earliest known examples of climate-managed storage in the ancient world, crucial for protecting perishable trade goods on a continental scale. A few paces away, shallow carvings on the walls catch your eye, symbols resembling letters, dots, and curves. Some scholars read them as inventory marks, shorthand for the goods once piled below. 2 jars of incense, 4 measures of wine. Check weight before departure. Ancient accounting graffiti. You can almost hear the scribe muttering, "Why does no one ever label their amphorae correctly?" A quirky tidbit: archaeologists once found a tiny bronze bell inside one of Petra's storage chambers. Its handle was shaped like a goat. Some suggest it belonged to a merchant who used it to call his assistants or his camel. The latter seems more likely, considering camels have strong opinions about being ignored. The walls shimmer as the sunlight creeps in through cracks. Dust motes float like lazy fireflies. You sit on a fallen block and listen to the hush, eerily quiet, except for the faint echo of your own breathing. The silence feels thick, purposeful. You start to understand why the Nabataeans preferred carving into rock instead of building freestanding structures. Stone doesn't just endure, it remembers. Historians still argue whether Petra's warehouses doubled as banks. Some suggest merchants deposited valuables here before continuing to Gaza or Damascus, trusting local guards and gods alike. Others think trade deals happened right inside these chambers, where weighing stones and bronze scales have been found. Maybe both are true. Petra might have been part temple, part stock exchange, part desert Airbnb for tired traders. The light shifts again. You move deeper into a corridor where the air cools sharply. There's a faint smell of oil, though nothing but dust remains. You imagine clay jars once stacked to the ceiling, labeled in multiple tongues: Aramaic, Greek, Nabataean. The city was multilingual long before global trade made it trendy. You brush dust from a cracked amphora rim. Inside, there's nothing but silence and sand. Yet your mind fills in the rest. Merchants counting coins by lamplight, whispering rates of exchange, camels groaning outside, guards gossiping about Rome's latest tax policy. Spoiler: everyone hated it. The clink of bronze scales, the scrape of parchment, the sudden laughter when someone tried to haggle too far. This is where the desert turned into money. Each storage hall served a network that stretched from the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean. Goods arrived in bundles, sometimes sealed with wax bearing merchant emblems. You picture a tired trader stamping his signet ring into soft resin, maybe a palm tree, maybe a crescent moon. Those little seals traveled far, crossing borders and empires long before the concept of a brand existed. Outside, a faint wind stirs. The hum it makes through narrow channels sounds like whispered chanting. You step out onto a ledge overlooking the canyon. From here, Petra's urban plan reveals itself like an ancient blueprint: streets lined with tombs, temples, and more storage facades carved high into cliffs. It's easy to forget this was once a fully functioning metropolis, not just a tourist backdrop for Indiana Jones. Down below, you spot remnants of stone platforms and column bases, market stalls, archaeologists say. Imagine the color, the sound linen fluttering in the breeze, traders shouting greetings in Arabic, Greek, maybe even Sanskrit. Spice seller spills a handful of saffron into the air just to prove it's real. Gold glints in the sun as deals are sealed with a handshake and a silent prayer. You hear the faint murmur of water again, one of those underground channels running beneath the warehouse complex. It's a reminder that wealth here always depended on that hidden heartbeat of water. Every jar of incense, every bolt of silk, owed its safety to the engineers who made sure the city didn't dry out. A half joke flits through your mind. The Nabataeans were basically the Amazon Prime of the 1st century BCE, fast, reliable, and with surprisingly few shipping losses. Though you suspect their customer service department might have included an actual spear, still, they built trust, and trust built wealth. When a caravan master left goods in a Petra warehouse, he expected to find them intact months later. And that reliability made Petra rich enough to carve its wealth right into the cliffs. A gust of wind sends a faint cascade of sand down from the ceiling. You blink it from your eyes and look back at the facade. The rose-red color seems to deepen as the sun climbs layers of iron oxide glowing like embers. You can almost see the movement of time within it, each grain recording an era. The desert hums softly. You take a last look around. The ledgers are gone, the amphorae empty, the voices dust. But somehow, the feeling lingers, order, ambition, and a hint of perfume. You start walking toward the canyon mouth again. Somewhere ahead, the rhythmic clop of invisible camels seems to echo in your ears. Maybe it's just your heartbeat syncing with theirs. The desert always rewards imagination, and as the first full rays of sun spill over the cliffs, you realize the warehouses were never just storage. They were the arteries of a living empire, pulsing with trade trust and dreams carved deep into stone. The path ahead narrows again, winding past half-crumbled walls and stunted tamarisk trees. A thin ribbon of light creeps between cliffs, brushing your face with the faintest warmth. You leave behind the echoing halls of commerce and step into the open air, where the real pulse of Petra once moved the people who made it all happen. The merchants may have signed the deals, but the caravanners lived them. And tonight, you're walking in their dust. You can almost hear the early morning shuffle hooves stamping harness bells, clinking the deep groan of camels disagreeing with breakfast. Someone coughs. Someone else swears softly in Nabataean. A boy, maybe 12, runs past with a wooden ladle filling bowls from a water skin. You smell dates roasting and barley boiling in a dented bronze pot. The air tastes of smoke and spice. You realize that this wasn't just trade, it was a traveling civilization. Each caravan was a miniature city on the move. There were drovers, cooks, guards, scribes, medics, even entertainers. A mainstream historical fact. Major Nabataean caravans could stretch for hundreds of animals and people traveling between key waypoints like Petra, Meda-in, Saleh, and Gaza. Some carried royal cargo, others hauled incense and ivory. Yet all shared a code, unwritten but strict. No stealing from your own caravan. No drinking from the water skins before the elders said yes. And most importantly, never mock a camel handler. They remember grudges and directions. You laugh quietly at that thought. The desert loves its lessons. A fringe tidbit. Some travelers' graffiti along caravan stops include short love poems scratched into rock faces in Nabataean script. One inscription reads roughly, "I walked this path and remembered her eyes." Scholars debate whether these were personal musings or coded messages to other merchants. Maybe it was just a lonely guy missing home. You can almost picture him, a trader, resting against a boulder, whispering lines to himself under the stars. Ancient poetry brought to you by insomnia and sand. Historians still argue whether these caravans were mostly composed of free merchants or heavily reliant on hired nomads and slaves. Some evidence points to cooperative guilds, Nabataean collectives, pooling resources for mutual protection. Others suggest elite families monopolized the routes, employing locals as temporary crew. The truth, as usual, probably sits somewhere between the tents. You pause at a flat stretch of ground where the remains of a campfire blacken the sand. Archaeologists have found hundreds of such traces, rings of stone, bits of ash camel dung turned to brittle pellets. They tell the same story: rest, warmth, departure. You imagine the camp alive again. Camels crouch to chew cud, nostrils flaring. Traders roll out rugs, counting beads on cords that double as accounting tools. A storyteller sits by the fire, reciting tales of Solomon's mines or the flying carpets of Sheba. Someone snorts at the exaggerations, but they keep listening anyway. You notice how the desert amplifies small sounds. A spoon dropped becomes a bell. Laughter carries miles. Maybe that's why their songs were soft, half sung, half whispered. You catch yourself humming an imaginary tune, low and steady, keeping time with the ghostly rhythm of hooves. The caravanners' lives balanced between monotony and sudden danger. Long stretches of nothingness punctuated by storms, raids, or sudden equipment failures. Camels were stubborn but dependable. They could carry up to 300 kilos across hundreds of kilometers. The Nabataean saddle, another of their quiet inventions, distributed weight evenly, saving both beast and cargo. You run your hand along a reconstructed model in a nearby museum shelter, well in your imagination. It's practical, elegant, and would make modern ergonomics professors nod approvingly. As the sun climbs higher, the canyon light turns white and sharp. You squint at faint lines etched into the cliff guidelines, carved to show optimal path angles. Ancient road signs, basically. Some are marked with short inscriptions: to the well of Ashara, safe path to the north. Others simply show a carved foot pointing the way. GPS, 1st century BCE edition. A dry wind kicks up dust. You taste salt and grit, blink it away, and picture the hardships these people accepted as normal. To them, the desert wasn't an enemy. It was a business partner. Tough, unpredictable, but ultimately reliable if you respected its moods. They understood the patterns of wind, the scent of distant rain, the call of birds that hinted at water nearby. You'd need Google Maps and 3 liters of bottled water before noon. Night must have been their favorite time. By torchlight, they mended ropes, told jokes, and traded gossip about cities they'd never seen. Maybe someone bragged about a cousin working in Rome. Maybe another cursed a sandstorm that had buried his last shipment. The stars above formed their compass, bright, cold witnesses to every success and failure. You look up now, and the same constellations hang there mostly unchanged. Orion still hunts. The Pleiades still shimmer like lost jewels. You feel tiny, but also connected like part of a story still in motion. The wind shifts again, bringing the faintest whiff of myrrh. It's phantom scent, surely, but it makes the past feel close enough to touch. You remember the warehouse halls, the wells, the stored wealth, and realize all of it depended on people who rarely got statues or inscriptions. They were the logistics workers of antiquity, the ones who walked, sweated, sang, and occasionally swore the routes into existence. You crouch to pick up a smooth pebble and roll it between your fingers. Maybe someone did the same 2 millennia ago, idly killing time while waiting for a stubborn camel to finish drinking. You pocket it without thinking, a harmless souvenir, a tactile reminder that history isn't just ruins, it's routine. Far off thunder murmurs a sandstorm, maybe. You imagine the caravan tightening its lines, cloths pulled over faces, water jars sealed. The sound grows louder, then fades as quickly as it came. Silence returns, vast and unbothered. You grin, whispering to yourself, guess they'd call that a light weather delay. As twilight falls again, campfires flicker to life in your mind's eye. A dog barks. Someone plays that same reed flute, slow and hypnotic. You can almost feel the comfort of community in motion, the strange peace of belonging, nowhere, but always moving forward. You pull your scarf tighter and start following their imagined path again, toward the faint glow of another cliff-cut complex, the next stop in the long chain of desert commerce. Somewhere ahead, spices and silks wait to be weighed, and you realize you've just walked into the fragrance of fortune. The smell hits you, first sweet, resinous, exotic. Even now, it clings faintly to the sandstone, as if the air itself remembers the caravans that once perfumed the desert. You're standing in what used to be Petra's spice quarter, where the Nabataeans turned scent into empire. The dawn is soft, the light pink as powdered rose petals, and for a moment you feel like you're inhaling history, cardamom, cinnamon, frankincense, myrrh, the aroma of ancient ambition. The trade that pulsed through these routes wasn't just about money, it was about the sensory desires of empires. Rome wanted the East's fragrances for temples and funerals. Egypt needed incense for its gods. Judea burned spices in its rituals. A mainstream historical fact by the 1st century BCE. The incense trade was so valuable that some Roman officials called Arabia Aromatica, estimating its annual profits to rival those of Egypt's grain export. Every whiff of frankincense came with a story and a tax. You step over a cracked jar, its rim blackened by ancient resin. The desert preserves scent better than memory. And for an instant, you swear you can smell the ghost of burned incense. You picture the caravan unloading here, camels kneeling, with weary grace handlers, untying bundles wrapped in goat hide. When they cut them open, pale yellow tears of frankincense tumbled out solidified resin from boswellia trees, growing hundreds of miles to the south in what's now Yemen and Oman. Myrrh followed, darker, more bitter, used for embalming and medicine. The air would have turned thick with scent, almost intoxicating. A quirky tidbit: some Nabataean traders supposedly chewed small bits of frankincense as breath freshener and spiritual protection before long trips. It sounds expensive, but then again, these were people who literally measured wealth by fragrance. Historians still argue whether the Nabataeans controlled the incense trade by monopoly, guarding source routes with armed patrols, or whether they simply taxed and facilitated trade for others. Archaeological evidence is mixed. Some ports show clear Nabataean influence. Others hint that they shared power with rival Arab tribes. Maybe Petra wasn't a cartel, but the hub of a massive loose federation of merchants. Either way, everything fragrant in the ancient world seems to have passed through their hands, or at least their ledgers. You brush sand from your sleeve and follow a row of half-buried storage rooms. The walls are scorched in places, suggesting that incense wasn't just stored here. It was processed, dried, and graded. Quality control, first century style. The finest grade went to temples and royal courts. The rest filled marketplaces or traveled north toward Gaza. Frankincense even had brand zones named for their source valleys. Imagine trying to explain to a Roman senator that his shipment was from Dhofar, not Hadramaut, and therefore worth 3 times more. Ancient marketing at its finest. A merchant's shout echoes in your imagination. Pure resin, no bark, guaranteed to please the gods or your money back. You laugh quietly. Some sales pitches never change. In the distance, a faint road curls westward, the incense root itself, worn into the earth by thousands of hooves. The Nabataeans called it the way of the south wind because the monsoon brought the trees to life each year. You picture a line of camels shimmering in the heat, each carrying twin panniers, heavy with the desert's perfume. It's not hard to imagine that on windy days, whole caravans smelled better than most modern perfume counters. You pause beside a low stone altar carved with a sun symbol. It was once used for offering incense to the gods before departure, a ritual blending business and belief. The Nabataeans didn't separate the two. Trade was sacred. Burning a pinch of your own cargo was a sign of trust, a way of saying, may this journey be profitable, and may no camel get ideas about sitting down halfway. As the sun rises higher, shadows retreat, and the sandstone glows as if lit from within. You trace your finger over faint Nabataean script carved into the altar's side. A prayer, maybe, to Dushara, keeper of roads and rain. You whisper it aloud, and the sound vanishes instantly, swallowed by the canyon. In your mind's eye, you see the trade flowing south to the incense fields of Arabia, Felix east to the spice markets of Mesopotamia, north to Damascus, west to the Mediterranean. Pepper cloves, nutmeg, and silk joined the mix, later turning Petra into a crossroads of scent, flavor, and fabric. Some routes even reached as far as India. The Nabataeans rarely sailed themselves. Instead, they relied on Red Sea partners, managing logistics from inland depots. Efficiency was their religion. And yet the desert was never predictable. Sandstorms, raids, and taxation disputes could erase profits overnight. One wrong treaty and your entire trade network evaporated. Maybe that's why their gods favored incense. It's fleeting and visible, and yet somehow eternal, like wealth in smoke form. You sit on a boulder, pull your scarf over your face against a sudden gust, and think about what it must have felt like to live inside that smell every day. For the Nabataeans, it wasn't exotic. It was normal. Their children probably played among incense sacks the way modern kids play near cardboard boxes. You smile at the thought of some merchant's toddler proudly trying to eat a lump of myrrh, grimacing, then deciding never to do that again. Nearby, a collapsed wall reveals a tiny niche, maybe a household shrine. You can still see traces of blackened soot inside. Someone once stood here, lighting a resin cone and murmuring a prayer before a small statue. Not for power or conquest, but for safe returns and fair trade wins. You feel a quiet respect for their simplicity. The air grows warmer, the smell of dust returns, overtaking the phantom sweetness. You rise, brushing sand from your knees, and glance once more toward the incense road stretching into the haze. It seems endless, like a ribbon leading into memory itself. In the silence, a thought lingers. Civilizations rise and fall, but the scents they leave behind never truly vanish. They cling to the stones, drift through centuries, waiting for someone to breathe them in again. And tonight, that someone is you. The road ahead beckons with a faint shimmer, like the edge of a mirage. You adjust your cloak and start walking toward it. Somewhere, beyond those ridges, the camels are waiting again, their loads full of stories wrapped in spice. The trail winds upward, through the pale dunes and low ridges where the sandstone fades into gravel. The air smells of heat and iron, though the sun is still young. You follow the faint groove of a path beaten smooth by centuries of hooves. The sound of camels rises in your imagination again. Grumbling, sighing, chewing creatures, as unimpressed by human ambition as any living thing could be. If the Nabataean trade empire had a true engine, it was these long-lashed, bad-tempered geniuses of endurance. You stop beside a half-buried block, carved with faint Nabataean letters. Maybe it once marked a resting post or repair yard. You crouch, brush away the sand, and spot a shallow indentation shaped like a saddle frame. You can almost see the scene handlers tightening straps, checking ropes, grumbling about prices. A trader haggles over feed. Somewhere, a boy whistles off-key while sweeping camel droppings into a pit. Civilization meet logistics. A mainstream historical fact, the Nabataean saddle was revolutionary. Unlike earlier North Arabian saddles, which sat low and rubbed the camel's hump raw, the Nabataean design had twin wooden arches front and back that distributed weight evenly, allowing for heavier cargo and longer journeys. It turned camels into cargo trucks with personality. This simple innovation transformed trade across Arabia, cutting travel time and reducing animal injuries. You run your hand along an imaginary saddle, feeling the grain of wood, the knots in the rope, the faint grease of camel fat used to protect leather from cracking. The saddle's high front gave the rider leverage. The rear arch balanced loads. Add a woven blanket underneath, and you had comfort, or at least the ancient world's definition of it. A quirky tidbit. Some old Bedouin legends claim that Nabataean saddles squeaked deliberately. A superstition said that squeaks warded off evil spirits. Scholars haven't found proof, but you smile at the thought of a superstitious merchant oiling every strap except one just to be safe. The wind stiffens. You pull your scarf across your face and watch dust drift across the horizon in lazy spirals. The desert always looks empty until you realize it's filled with invisible pathways. Some marked by stones, others by instinct. The Nabataean caravans could navigate with uncanny accuracy even in featureless sand. How they read the land like a scroll. They memorized star paths Orion in winter, Canopus in summer. They counted dunes between wadis timed travel by the position of Venus at dawn. Some even tracked migrating birds or the taste of soil to find hidden springs. A scribe once wrote that the desert tells its secrets only to those who listen without impatience. You try to listen now, the faint hiss of sand, the low whistle of wind between rocks, your own heartbeat echoing softly in your ears. Historians still argue whether the Nabataeans used formal maps. So far, no parchment routes have survived. Some scholars believe they relied entirely on oral navigation traditions passed from master caravanners to apprentices. Others think simple clay tablets marked major wells and toll stations, but none have been found. The absence of evidence, as always, drives historians delightfully mad. You squint toward a line of low mounds. Excavations there uncovered fragments of wooden beams, possible way stations or rest shelters. Imagine one, a rectangle of reed mats, a clay hearth, and a stone trough filled with brackish water. Not much, but after 40 miles of emptiness, it must have looked like paradise. The caravan would halt camels kneeling in unison with theatrical sighs. Men would curse the sun affectionately and collapse in the shade. You find a broken piece of pottery, half buried in the sand, curved and ribbed. Maybe part of a water jug dropped during one such stop. You turn it over, feeling its smooth underside. It's warm from the sun, a small thing forgotten, but you can tell it was handmade thin but sturdy, designed for travel. Efficiency again. Somewhere beyond the ridge, you imagine hearing a shout, perhaps a driver calling "hoosh" to make his camel kneel. You grin. The command hasn't changed in 2,000 years. Camels still understand the same language, which says something about their intelligence or our stubbornness. You walk on, and the path widens into a dry plain, dotted with shallow rock basins, ancient troughs carved to catch runoff. Camels would drink here one after another in slow procession. The smell must have been overwhelming: animal musk, sweat water, and the sour tang of fermented feed. But in that smell, there was wealth. Every sip a promise of another day's trade. You stop at one basin and peer into its cracked interior. A faint echo answers a pigeon fluttering out from the shadows. You flinch, laugh softly, and whisper, "Guess you inherited the rest stop." Nearby, a stone carving of a camel stands half eroded yet unmistakable. Its legs are short, body stout, head proud. The sculptor didn't aim for realism, but reverence. The camel wasn't just transport, it was survival incarnate. The Nabataeans even minted coins showing camels beside altars, linking trade and divinity in one dusty icon. The sun climbs higher. Heat wavers on the horizon, bending shapes into mirages. You see flickering forms that look like ships, but they're only dunes shimmering. You imagine caravanners centuries ago, seeing the same illusion, muttering, "If only we could sail across that." Ironically, later, they did. Some Nabataean merchants eventually learned to partner with seafaring Arabs and Greeks, extending their trade through the Red Sea. Land met ocean, saddle met sail. A breeze cools your face. For a second, you think of modern highways and semi-trucks, metal beasts following asphalt routes, not so different from these. You picture a Nabataean merchant squinting at a convoy of 21st century cargo trucks and saying, needs more camels." You chuckle softly, shaking your head. The desert doesn't change, only our toys do. As twilight begins to soften the edges of the cliffs, you imagine the caravan halting again. Fires bloom, tents unfold, and a dozen voices rise in song. The melody loops hypnotic steady as the walking rhythm of camels. You listen, eyes half closed, and realize the song isn't about glory or conquest. It's about patience, the quiet strength of moving through nothingness, trusting the road, the stars, and the beasts beside you. You breathe out slowly, matching the rhythm of the invisible hooves. Somewhere beyond this plain lies the next pulse of the Nabataean machine. The writing, the records, the marks of memory left by traders who refused to vanish into sand. The desert narrows again into a passage of stone walls rising on both sides like frozen waves. The air cools suddenly, shadows deepening to blue. You feel the temperature drop through your clothes. This isn't a canyon so much as a throat leading you toward the heart of something ancient. You recognize the rhythm of chisel marks on the wall, Nabataean craftsmanship, deliberate and rhythmic, a kind of stone handwriting. Ahead, faint traces of plaster shimmer under your light. You've reached one of the Nabataean record posts, their bureaucratic fingerprints on the desert skin. Here, among the silence, someone once tallied taxes, sealed trade deals, and recorded debts in ink that has long turned to dust. You kneel beside a low alcove, half collapsed. Inside, a slab bears faint writing in Nabataean Aramaic, an ancestor of Arabic. The letters curl elegantly like the flow of desert wind. A mainstream historical fact, the Nabataean script evolved directly into early Arabic. You could almost call it the language's childhood stage. Scribes here perfected the curves and dots that centuries later would shape the Quranic calligraphy of Islam. In other words, somewhere in this canyon, the alphabet of a civilization learned to dance. You trace the faint lines with your finger, murmuring the names. You can still make out merchant caravan master, city of origin. Each one feels like a pulse of memory. The Nabataeans didn't just trade goods, they traded knowledge. Their literacy rate for a merchant society was astonishingly high. Tax collectors, inventory keepers, scribes, paperwork kept the wheels of profit turning as surely as any camel. A quirky tidbit some graffiti discovered on caravan stops read like ancient truck stop humor. One inscription translates roughly to Barakel was "Here his camel hates him." Another simply says, "Prophets smell better than incense." Even 2,000 years ago, traders found ways to make boredom immortal. You smile at the thought, then step deeper into the canyon. The light grows golden, glancing off the walls in narrow beams. The air tastes of dust and old iron. Somewhere ahead, a spring whispers. You follow the sound until you reach a small square basin, water still pooling faintly at the bottom. Above it, a weathered inscription reads, "Gift of Aretas for the travelers." Historians still argue whether Aretas refers to Aretas IV, the king who ruled during the height of Petra's power, or one of his descendants. Either way, the spring was civic generosity or clever marketing. Imagine inscribing your name on every public fountain in a desert empire. It's ancient branding at its finest. You kneel and dip your fingers into the trickle of water. It's cool, tasting faintly of minerals and salt. You imagine weary merchants filling goatskin flasks here, their faces glowing with relief. A few camels probably tried to nudge their way in earning curses and slaps. The Nabataeans built hundreds of such installations, cisterns, channels, dams, turning an unforgiving desert into a network of hydration. This was their true miracle, hydraulic engineering disguised as divine providence. Some channels still work after millennia. The system was so efficient that modern hydrologists study it for lessons in sustainable desert living. You run your hand along the carved stone gutter beside the spring. The groove dips and twists with mathematical precision, angled just enough to catch rain without letting sand clog the flow. This was water management without metal pipes, GPS, or spreadsheets, just stone slope and genius. As you rest, you picture a Nabataean scribe sitting here at dusk, stylus in hand, recording the caravan's arrival. His reed pen scratches on parchment as he tallies 10 camels from Luca Comey, carrying cinnamon, frankincense, and pearls. The ink is lamp black, mixed with gum and water. The document will be rolled, sealed with bitumen, and tucked into a clay jar for storage. Somewhere in Petra, a clerk will copy it into a master ledger. Bureaucracy, the one thing humans have always done consistently well. The scribe pauses, stretches, and watches the sky turn violet. Maybe he scratches a quick joke into the margin, something about tax collectors always showing up after the rain. Then he blows gently on the ink to dry it, unaware that you'd be reading about him 2,000 years later. You rise and continue along the canyon. The walls narrow until you have to turn sideways to pass. Your shoulder brushes the rock, and tiny grains fall whispering. At the next turn, the path widens again, into an open shelf overlooking a valley. From here you can see faint lines, ancient caravan ruts crisscrossing below, like the veins of the desert, each line a route of memory. You think about how writing and trade shaped each other. Without record-keeping, profit is chaos. Without profit, writing gets expensive. The Nabataeans balanced both beautifully. Their script wasn't just art. It was survival insurance. Every dot meant a counted bag. Every curve meant a paid tax. You can almost hear an old merchant saying, "The pen weighs less than a camel load, but it saves a fortune." You grin and imagine that carved on a stone tablet somewhere. Far in the distance, lightning flashes silent and white. Maybe a storm is brewing over Edom. The air tastes metallic, the wind shifting. You find a niche in the wall where soot darkens the ceiling. A lamp once burned here, its flame flickering over ledgers and tired faces. The light must have danced across the stone, making the letters seem alive. You sit for a while, closing your eyes, listening to echoes of scratching pens, murmured prayers, the rhythmic groan of resting camels. It's strange, so much order amid chaos. These people carved spreadsheets into stone while the wind howled outside. Civilization, it seems, has always needed both accountants and adventurers. When you stand again, your footsteps crunch on gravel that was once ink-stained floor. You glance back, half expecting to see someone sitting there, a scribe bent over his scroll, nodding slightly, acknowledging you before fading into dust. The wind moves through the canyon, lifting a swirl of sand that glitters briefly in the slanting sun. You watch it spiral upward, like letters unspooling into the air. Somewhere the script of history keeps writing itself, and for tonight, you're following every line. You emerge from the canyon just as the sun dips behind the ridges, turning the desert copper. The silence spreads wide and soft, broken only by the faint hum of wind against the rocks. Before you lies a shallow depression in the earth, ringed by low stone walls, an ancient caravanserai, a resting fort, a small city of exhaustion and anticipation. You step down into it, your boots crunching on crushed pottery and camel prints fossilized by time. The air here feels heavier, as if the stories haven't quite left. You can almost hear them, traders shouting greetings, cooks clanging bronze pots, animals snorting and stamping the sand into clouds. Once this place was a hive, half hotel, half fortress. The Nabataeans built it for one reason: to turn fatigue into business. Every thirsty traveler was also a customer. A mainstream historical fact: archaeologists have found dozens of such caravanserai along the Nabataean incense routes, spaced roughly one day's travel apart, about 30 kilometers, depending on terrain and camel mood. They were built around central courtyards with wells, storage rooms, kitchens, and raised sleeping platforms. Some even had small temples to Dushara or Al-Uzza, the desert gods of luck and rain. You walk through a crumbled archway into what was once the courtyard. The ground dips toward a square cistern now filled with sand. You kneel beside it, brushing away grit until your fingers strike stone. Someone carved a pattern here, a spiral looping inward like a whirlpool. Maybe decoration, maybe a symbol for the constant coming and going of trade, or maybe just a bored mason having fun. A quirky tidbit: a Roman travel diary from the 2nd century CE describes one Nabataean caravanserai as a place of ceaseless argument, where even the camels seemed to debate. The author complained that the air was thick with gossip bargaining and the smell of roasted goat. You grin. Apparently, customer service has always been a bit chaotic. The evening light softens everything. You wander through narrow rooms, each one opening into another like an echo. Charcoal stains mark where torches once burned. Small niches hint at shelves for valuables. In one corner, you find the remains of a low oven, just a ring of bricks, but you can almost feel the ghost heat. You picture cooks preparing lentil stew bread, baked on hot stones, dates simmered in honey for dessert. After a month of salted camel jerky that must have tasted divine, you sit on the low wall and imagine the scene at dusk 2,000 years ago. The courtyard alive with lamplight. A dozen fires, glowing smoke, rising straight up into a calm sky. A storyteller gesturing grandly as he recounts some heroic camel chase. An accountant scribbling tallies under a flickering flame. A group of guards laughing too loud at jokes that were probably terrible. The smell of cardamom tea fills the air, mingling with dust, sweat, and roasted grain. Someone plucks a stringed instrument, maybe a rababa, the ancestor of the violin. Its notes tremble across the night, melancholy and beautiful. A trader hums along, his voice rough from the road. You can feel the rhythm of ancient camaraderie, a momentary family born out of distance. Historians still argue whether caravanserais like this were state-run or privately owned. Some evidence points to royal funding under Aretas IV, suggesting a centralized system. Others argue they were built by wealthy merchants who rented rooms to passing caravans. Either way, they were vital, the beating hearts of desert logistics. You stand and wander, toward a raised platform at the far end. Its stones are smoother, more deliberate. Perhaps it once served as a prayer area. The Nabataeans often blended faith into every structure. They never truly separated the sacred from the practical. You touch the stone, cool and slightly pitted, and imagine a merchant pausing here, whispering a brief thanks before counting his profits. Above the sky deepens into indigo. Stars start to appear. First one, then a dozen, then a flood. You realize how bright they are out here, unchallenged by modern glare. You can almost see the same constellations that guided those caravans centuries ago. You tilt your head back and trace Orion's belt with your finger, whispering, "Still on duty, huh?" A soft wind stirs sand across the courtyard. You imagine how it must have sounded when everyone was asleep. The low breathing of camels, the creak of ropes, the sigh of the desert. The whole world reduced to texture and sound. For a moment, you almost drift off, too lulled by the stillness. Then you notice a faint carving on the wall near the entryway, two camels facing each other, a star between them. Underneath, a Nabataean inscription reads, "Under the same sky, all roads meet." You run your fingers over the words, the grooves filled with fine dust. It's such a simple phrase, yet you feel it settle deep in your chest. Maybe that's why the Nabataeans built all this, to prove that even in the emptiest place, connections mattered. You step outside the walls and climb a short rise to look back. From here, the caravanserai glows in starlight, half buried but unmistakably geometric, a square of order amid chaos. You imagine torchlight flickering again, shadows moving, laughter echoing faintly across the plain. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another caravanserai waits another day's journey away. Between them stretches the same sand, the same stars, the same strange quiet that links all travelers who've ever stopped to rest before pushing forward again. You breathe in deeply, the night air cool and laced with the faint tang of stone. You murmur almost to yourself, "Under the same sky," and let the rest drift away. Behind you, the wind shifts again, carrying whispers that might be words or just memory rustling through ancient corridors. Either way, it's time to move. The road doesn't wait, and somewhere ahead lies the next flicker of civilization, the Nabataean way stations of water and light, keeping the desert alive, one whisper at a time. Morning arrives, with a silence so vast it almost hums. The desert light spills slowly over the ridge, turning every rock gold and every shadow blue. You wake to the faintest cool breeze, the kind that carries sand like secret handwriting. The caravanserai lies quiet behind you, just a square of stone returning to sleep. Ahead stretches the road again, curling toward the horizon, where low mists rise like breath. You shoulder your pack and begin walking. A few miles on the path narrows into a shallow ravine, and something gleams from the rock face, a channel perfectly straight carved into the sandstone. You crouch beside it, brush away the dust, and discover it runs for meters, maybe hundreds, joining others into a network. Here lies the Nabataeans' true genius, their hidden waterways. A mainstream historical fact, the Nabataeans engineered one of the most advanced desert hydraulic systems of the ancient world. They carved channels to catch seasonal floods, directing the flow into cisterns sealed with plaster so fine that some still hold water today. These reservoirs, hidden under cliffs or inside courtyards allowed their cities and caravan stops to flourish where rainfall averaged less than 100 millimeters a year. You follow one of the channels uphill, tracing its smooth inner curve. The gradient is perfect, just enough for steady flow, not enough to cause erosion. You can almost imagine an engineer, head wrapped in linen, squinting at the sun while tilting a water skin to test the slope. No lasers, no blueprints, just instinct and geometry carved into stone. A quirky tidbit. Some archaeologists believe Nabataean engineers used date pits as primitive leveling tools. They'd drop them in the channel with a trickle of water. If the seeds floated too fast, the slope was wrong. Hydraulics by fruit, you whisper smiling. The air is cooler here, the shade deepening as the channel hugs the cliff. You run your hand along the wall, feeling how smooth it is. The Nabataeans lined some channels with a mixture of lime ash and crushed ceramic, creating a waterproof glaze. You picture workers mixing plaster in clay basins, sweating in the heat, arguing about which god deserved credit for their patience. You stop at a narrow opening where the channel disappears into a cavern. Inside it widens into a chamber, the reservoir itself. Your voice echoes softly as you step in. The floor dips gently to a still pool at the bottom, fed by a thin trickle of condensation. You kneel beside it and catch the faint scent of minerals and stone. Imagine arriving here in the dry season, leading your caravan to a hidden spring while others perished miles away. This water would have felt like a miracle. Maybe that's why the Nabataeans built small altars beside many reservoirs, offering incense or carved symbols of gratitude. To them, engineering was worship made practical. You notice black streaks on the ceiling, ancient smoke from oil lamps. That means people came here often, maybe to fill jars by torchlight. You can almost hear their voices echoing in the dark, soft, weary, thankful. Historians still argue whether the Nabataean water system was centrally coordinated or locally improvised. Some believe royal engineers planned routes connecting Petra to outlying forts and farms. Others think each community adapted the master techniques independently. Either way, the precision suggests not chaos, but collaboration. A civilization that trusted its builders as much as its kings. You climb out of the reservoir into sunlight again. The desert shimmers with heat, though it's barely midday. In the distance, low stone mounds mark old agricultural terraces, proof that the Nabataeans didn't just hoard water, they used it to coax green life from sand. Fig trees, barley vines, they built check dams to slow runoff, creating small gardens along seasonal wadis. You can almost see them, tiny bursts of green against endless ochre, proof that faith in water was stronger than fear of drought. You walk through one such terrace, the walls knee-high and curved like ancient smiles. Between them, the soil still looks darker, richer. You crouch, scoop a handful, and rub it between your fingers. Gritty, but not lifeless. A whisper of fertility remains. You remember how the Nabataeans were called the gardeners of stone. They didn't fight the desert, they negotiated with it. You rest beneath a leaning acacia, its shadow trembling. Somewhere nearby, a cicada buzzes lazily. The air smells faintly of sap and hot rock. You sip from your flask, feeling the absurd irony. 2,000 years ago, this same water pattern probably quenched another traveler right here. The desert is nothing if not consistent in its hospitality and humor. You glance up toward the cliffs where narrow gutters glint in sunlight. They look like veins or script, as if the desert itself were writing poetry in stone. Maybe it is every line a verse about patience, endurance, and the quiet defiance of people who refused to accept impossible as a forecast. You find yourself thinking about modern dams and pipelines, so grand, so loud, and realize that the Nabataeans achieved sustainability without machinery by working with the land's rhythm, not against it. You murmur, half to yourself, they didn't conquer the desert, they made a deal. A gust of wind rushes through the channel behind you, whistling like a low flute. You close your eyes and let it wash over you. For a moment, it sounds like applause, nature clapping softly for its most patient students. As evening approaches, you climb a slope overlooking the whole valley. The channels glint in the dying light, forming a pattern that looks almost like constellations fallen to earth. You imagine them flowing at full capacity after a rare desert storm, water racing through stone arteries, spilling into cisterns, feeding gardens, blessing every trader who passed. The whole landscape alive with motion and relief. You sit until the light fades, and in that silence, you feel something shift. The ancient world doesn't feel far away anymore. It feels layered beneath your feet, still pulsing faintly, waiting to be remembered. The desert, after all, never forgets its engineers. When darkness falls, you stand and start down the path again, guided by the silver glow of a half moon. The channels glimmer faintly beside you, like mirrored trails of light. For the Nabataeans, water was treasure, yes, but also memory. And tonight, as you walk along their carved veins, it feels like you're moving through the very lifeblood of their vanished world. The moonlight follows you down the slope, silvering the sand and throwing long shadows across the cliffs. The desert feels different at night, gentler, almost companionable. The air cools fast, wrapping you in a hush that tastes faintly of salt and wind. Somewhere far off, a jackal calls its voice, bending through the valleys like a single violin note that never quite fades. You pause for a moment just listening. You're now heading toward the heart of the Nabataean realm, their capital Petra. But before reaching that rose-red city, the road dips through something stranger, a ghost orchard of stone. The Nabataeans, ever the architects of illusion, carved their necropolis along the caravan approaches, turning tombs into billboards of eternity. Every merchant, diplomat, and traveler passed through the city of the dead before reaching the city of the living. Subtle right nothing says, "Welcome to town," like a mile of rock-cut mausoleums. The first facade catches the moon like a blade. It's huge, 3 stories of carved perfection, its columns fluted and its pediment fading into shadow. You stand at its base, craning your neck until your hat nearly slips off. The stone glows pink even at night, and you realize that in daylight this would blaze like fire. A mainstream historical fact. These monumental tombs date mostly to the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE, Petra's golden era. They were not royal graves alone. Wealthy traders commissioned facades that blended Hellenistic symmetry with native flair. You can see Corinthian columns topped with Nabataean floral motifs, Egyptian cornices above Greek-style doors. It's as if an entire civilization decided to mix architectural styles just to show off how cosmopolitan they'd become. You step closer, running your fingers along the carved edge of a column. The surface is still smooth after 2,000 years. Sandstone, it turns out, ages beautifully when treated with respect. You imagine the stonemasons working by torchlight chisels, ringing through the night, their movements rhythmic as prayer. A quirky tidbit: archaeologists once found faint red paint residues on some facades, suggesting that parts of Petra's necropolis were once brightly colored scarlet, blue, and gold. So yes, the rose-red city might once have been the technicolor palace of eternal flexing. Picture neon-bright tombs glowing in the desert sun. You mutter, ancient Las Vegas, but quieter, and grin to yourself. The moon climbs higher, and you move deeper among the tombs. The facades seem endless. Urn tomb, silk tomb, Corinthian tomb, palace tomb, each with a personality. Some are ornate and balanced, others rough and half-finished, as if the stonemason decided halfway through that the client's check had bounced. You duck through one open doorway into cool shadow. Inside the chamber is bare, just a smooth floor and dark alcoves cut into the walls. The air smells faintly of dust and time. You whisper something, anything just to hear it echo, and the sound bounces softly back like a sigh. Historians still argue whether these tombs were used continuously or ceremonially sealed after burial. Some show evidence of repeated visits, offerings, and gatherings, suggesting that Nabataeans didn't see death as final exile, but as an ongoing relationship. Others think the grand facades were more about civic pride than funerary function. Either way, the dead here were never forgotten. They became landmarks. You step back outside, and for a long moment, you just stand in the silence. The moonlight outlines the facades like theater scenery, row upon row of doorways leading nowhere. You can almost imagine a caravan arriving at dawn, camels, shifting traders whispering torches, flickering the cliffs glowing pink, as if the city itself were waking. You sit on a rock and pull your cloak tighter. There's something comforting about how permanent everything feels here, even though you know the sandstone is slowly eroding. The Nabataeans built not to defy time, but to be remembered through it. Each facade, a whispered message: we were here, we mattered. A faint breeze moves through the canyon, and you think you hear low music, the imagined echo of some long-ago ritual. Maybe they played flutes and drums here to honor their ancestors, the rhythms bouncing off the walls until sound itself seemed to come from the rock. The living speaking to the dead, and the dead answering through echo. You lie back against the stone, gazing up at a strip of stars between the cliffs. The Milky Way looks almost liquid, a river of light flowing over the tombs. You wonder how many travelers slept here just like this, wrapped in their cloaks, halfway between exhaustion and awe. You murmur, "Don't worry, I'm just passing through," though part of you isn't sure who you're talking to. It's strange, these tombs don't feel haunted. They feel inhabited by memory, not fear. You can sense the pride of builders, the patience of artisans, the quiet gratitude of merchants who finally earned their rest. Maybe that's the real secret. The Nabataeans didn't build to escape death. They built to turn it into architecture. You think about modern skyscrapers, mausoleums of glass and steel, and wonder if we've really changed all that much. We still build to be seen to leave a mark to prove we existed. The Nabataeans just had better taste in stone. A shooting star slices across the sky, vanishing before you can wish on it. You smile anyway. Somewhere nearby, the faintest glimmer of dawn touches the eastern horizon. Time to keep moving, because beyond the necropolis lies Petra proper, the city that once made even Roman emperors jealous. The one carved not for death, but for the living pulse of trade, worship, and wonder. You rise, stretch, and whisper a small goodbye to the silent facades. The cliffs seem to nod back in moonlight, approving of your quiet exit. The sand crunches softly underfoot as you follow the canyon deeper toward the city that glows like a dream waiting to be rediscovered. The canyon narrows until it's barely wide enough for a single camel to pass, and then suddenly it opens like a secret being revealed. You step out of the shadowed sick into sunlight, and there it is, Petra's treasury, Al-Khazini. The kind of sight that makes your brain short-circuit for a second because it looks less like architecture and more like a magic trick, frozen in stone. The facade glows peach and gold, its columns soaring straight out of the rock face. 2 stories tall, with Corinthian capitals and a broken pediment framing an urn at the top, it's both precise and theatrical, like a sculpted mirage. You stand there, blinking in the glare, and whisper the only words that fit. Okay, that's ridiculous. The treasury is famous, of course. Indiana Jones postcards, endless tourist photos. But standing here in the hush of morning, you realize what makes it transcendent isn't its fame. It's its silence. The cliffs swallow every echo. Even the air seems to hold its breath. You walk closer, craning your neck to take in the details carved with impossible finesse. Reliefs of Amazon's vines, eagles' gods, half Greek, half local. Nabataean artists had a habit of remixing mythologies like DJs before their time. You spot Isis Dionysus, and maybe even a local desert deity whose name has long vanished into dust. Historians still argue whether this monument was originally a royal tomb, a temple, or some glorious hybrid of both. Some believe it housed the remains of a Nabataean king. Others think it guarded the city's treasury, though no gold was ever found here, only echoes. That's the historical fact. Its date around the 1st century BCE during Petra's height, when spice caravans made the city one of the richest hubs in the region. Gold and myrrh flowed in marble, and silk went out, and everything passed beneath the serene gaze of this facade. You step into the shadow of its columns. The interior chamber is surprisingly small. The sandstone walls, smooth and bare, cool against your fingertips. A quirky tidbit local legend once claimed that the urn atop the facade held a pharaoh's treasure, and for centuries, Bedouins fired bullets at it, hoping to crack it open. The urn's pockmarked surface still carries those tiny scars, a quiet record of centuries of hope and bad aim. You can almost picture the scene desert travelers resting their camels at the canyon's mouth, whispering that the urn gleamed differently at sunrise, that maybe, just maybe, it hid something more than dust. And that's the spell Petra casts. It convinces you that the impossible might just be slightly possible. You turn back toward the canyon floor, where the air hums faintly with flies and footsteps. Around you, Other facades line the cliffs, smaller, rougher, half-eroded. But each once belonged to someone who mattered: a priest, a trader, maybe a woman who ran a caravan of her own. The city was never just about kings. It was a web of ambitions carved in stone. Past the treasury, the valley widens into a cityscape without rooftops. The streets are sunken in sand now, but you can trace their lines: the colonnaded avenue, the open forum, the outlines of markets where voices once clashed like cymbals. The sandstone glows pink-orange and honey. Every step releases a soft crunch that echoes faintly off the cliffs like applause from ghosts. You imagine the crowd merchants haggling in Nabataean Greek Aramaic, maybe even Latin. The air thick with spice dust, goat bells, and laughter. A man counts coins in the shade, while a woman sells dyed cloth, shimmering blue as lapis. Overhead, pigeons whirl through slivers of sky, and in every direction warehouses. Big square practical structures tucked into the rock, storing frankincense, pepper, and Arabian balsam bound for Syria, Egypt, and Rome. Here's your mainstream economic detail. Petra wasn't built as a random desert city. It was the nerve center connecting Arabia, Felix modern Yemen, and Oman to the Mediterranean. Nabataeans mastered water control and diplomacy so perfectly that they could charge tolls for safety and resupply, turning logistics into luxury. And those quiet warehouses? They were cultural crossroads. Archaeologists have found amphorae from Rhodes Roman glass, Indian ivory, and even Chinese silk fragments. Imagine it, a Nabataean merchant sipping fermented date wine while unpacking cargo from halfway across the known world. If Instagram had existed, Petra would have had trade goals. You climb a few steps to a half-collapsed facade and find faint graffiti scratched into the wall. Greek letters. A name: maybe Demetrios was here. You grin. Ancient travelers weren't so different from modern ones. The urge to leave your mark predates hashtags. Still, some of the marks are stranger, small Nabataean inscriptions, merchant tallies, or coded symbols historians still can't fully decipher. They might have been freight records, religious signs, or just doodles while waiting for a deal to close. Historians still argue whether these inscriptions were formal notations or personal graffiti. Either way, they whisper the same thing: someone stood here. Someone cared enough to carve this. You find a shady spot under an acacia and sit watching the light shift along the cliffs. In this heat, the sandstone breathes colors, deepening shadows crawling upward. You sip from your canteen and imagine a Nabataean merchant doing the same 2 millennia ago, wiping sweat from his brow with the same casual gesture. A breeze stirs the dust, carrying the faintest smell of sage. You feel a strange calm. The city, for all its grandeur, isn't trying to impress you. It's just existing as it always has. The facade, the tombs, the warehouses, they're less about ego than endurance. A civilization that understood beauty, not as decoration, but as permanence. A shadow flickers across your hand. You glance up. A hawk circles overhead, its cry slicing the quiet. Somewhere behind you, the sick whispers with wind. You can almost hear the echo of sandal soles, camel bells, and human laughter mingling in time. You lean back, eyelids heavy, and think, they carved eternity just to make trade a little prettier. Then you laugh softly at the absurd perfection of that idea. Petra hums around you alive in its silence. The sandstone glows like embers, and you realize that the treasury's name might have been wrong all along. The true treasure isn't gold or urns, it's the city itself, holding centuries of footsteps inside its heart. The sun climbs higher, spilling white fire into every crack of sandstone. You pull your headscarf tighter, squinting at the colonnaded street stretching ahead, a corridor of broken columns, sun-bleached stone, and ghosted grandeur. This is where the Nabataeans met the Romans, where trade and empire collided like slow tectonic plates. Your boots crunch over ancient paving stones. They're still perfectly fitted, no mortar, just masterful geometry. Somewhere beneath your feet lie centuries of footsteps. Nabataean traders, Roman legionaries, maybe even a few bemused camels who wondered why humans insist on walking when sitting is so much nicer. You stop beside one of the standing columns. It's thicker than your torso, topped with a Corinthian capital, half eroded into a melted crown. The column casts a perfect sliver of shade, just enough to give you a brief reprieve. You lean against it, the surface hot and grainy, and watch dust swirl in the breeze like restless thought. A mainstream historical fact: when the Roman Empire annexed Nabataea in 106 CE under Emperor Trajan, the region became the province of Arabia Petraea. But unlike most conquests, this one was strangely civil. No battle, no sack. The Nabataeans, pragmatic as ever, probably saw the benefit of Roman roads and protection for their caravans. Trade didn't die, it adapted. You can still see the Roman imprint here. The city's main thoroughfare, once purely Nabataean, was straightened, widened, and lined with colonnades. They built a forum temples and a nymphaeum, a fountain dedicated to nymphs, because even in the desert, Romans never missed a chance to glorify water with marble. You walk toward the nymphaeum's remains, fragments of columns, a semicircular basin, and faint traces of painted plaster. Once, a spring ran here, pouring from carved lion heads into cool basins. Now, it's dry, but you can almost hear the laughter of children splashing in it 2 millennia ago. A quirky tidbit: archaeologists once found a small Roman coin wedged in a crack nearby, minted under Hadrian. Some think it was an offering to the fountain spirits. Others suspect a clumsy trader just dropped it. Either way, it's a reminder that superstition and commerce often share the same pockets. You keep walking until the columns end at the great temple's massive staircase. You climb the steps slowly, each one wide enough to make you feel small. At the top lies a platform large enough to host an army's worth of prayers. The temple's columns are shattered, but the symmetry remains. You can trace invisible lines of precision in the ruins, feel the rhythm of something mathematical beneath the dust. Historians still argue whether this was a temple, an administrative complex, or both. The layout suggests a blend of civic and sacred purpose, typical Nabataean efficiency. Why build two structures when one can multitask? Imagine city officials approving trade permits under a colonnade while priests offered incense nearby. Bureaucracy with aromatherapy. You wander among the fallen stones. Lizards skitter between cracks. The air smells faintly metallic, like sun on old coins. Somewhere in the distance, a raven croaks, a voice deep and dry as the cliffs. Below the great temple, the street slopes toward Petra's theater, carved directly into the rock. You descend the steps and stand before it 33 tiers of seating capable of holding over 6,000 spectators. The acoustics are so perfect that you can whisper at the stage and be heard in the back row. You test it softly, saying, "Don't forget to like and subscribe." The echo returns faintly, and you can't help laughing. It's hard to picture this silent amphitheater, filled with life. But once it would have been packed, merchants and fine linen laborers, dusty from the road, Roman soldiers, Nabataean nobles, all watching the same play or musical performance. The smell of roasted dates and sweat and incense mixing into something unmistakably human. The Romans didn't erase Nabataean culture. They absorbed it, dressed it in marble, and called it eternal. But the Nabataeans left their fingerprints everywhere. Look closely, and you see inscriptions in their script, carved alongside Latin dedications. Their gods, Dushara al-Uzza, still appear on altars long after Rome arrived, just under new names. You sit on a middle-tier gaze, sweeping over the stage and up toward the cliff line, where the tombs glitter faintly in the haze. From here, you can see the entire city, the street, the temples, the tombs, a tapestry of sandstone and sun. You remember the joke some archaeologists make: Petra didn't fall, it just got really good at waiting. And there's truth in that. When Rome's trade shifted toward the Red Sea ports, Petra slowly emptied. Caravans took shorter routes, and the desert reclaimed what empire had borrowed. But what's eerie is how much survived. The water systems, the facades, even the faint marks of Roman chisel work they endure, like a conversation paused mid-sentence. A hot wind rises, scattering pebbles. You close your eyes and imagine the old road networks extending from this city, like veins north to Damascus west, to Gaza, south to the Red Sea. The Romans improved them, adding milestones, rest stations, and signal towers. If you'd been a courier, you could have carried a letter from Petra to Alexandria in under 2 weeks, assuming no bandits, no storms, and that your camel wasn't in one of its famously stubborn moods. The empire brought prosperity, yes, but also bureaucracy and taxes. Trade became safer, yet slower, richer, yet more rigid. And in that balance, something of the Nabataean spirit, its independence, its improvisation, faded into formality. You can almost sense that shift in the stones. Nabataean curves giving way to Roman lines. Art turning into architecture. You rise, stretch, and let your fingers brush one of the seats as you pass. The stone is warm now, holding the morning's light. Somewhere, beneath your hand, faint tool marks ripple a mason's heartbeat preserved in stone. You take one last look around. The theater is empty, but it doesn't feel lonely. It feels paused, as if the next performance could start any second if only the wind remembered its lines. You walk down the slope, dust clinging to your boots. Ahead lies the path to the city's lower quarters, the part most tourists skip, but archaeologists love. The warehouses, workshops, and humble homes where real life happened. The elegant facades may tell history's headlines, but down there in the quiet rubble of everyday work, you'll find the Nabataeans still whispering their side of the story. The sun blazes overhead. You grin, wipe sweat from your brow, and mutter, "Time to clock in." By the time you reach the lower city, the air feels like it's holding its breath, still heavy, shimmering. A thin path curls between tumbled walls and half-buried doorways. You kick at a pebble, and it skitters downhill, tapping stone to stone until the sound fades. Somewhere to your left, a bird trills 3 notes and falls silent. This is where the Nabataeans actually lived, not in royal facades or grand temples, but in practical spaces, workshops, storage rooms, and domestic courtyards. The ground here is littered with pottery shards, bits of plaster, fragments of bone. It looks like nothing. And yet, to an archaeologist, this is where the story gets loudest. You crouch beside a low wall where someone's trowel has carved a neat trench through time. Layers of sand and soot and clay, each one a whisper from a different century. The top layer, windblown and pale, belongs to tourists and goats. The deeper you go, the darker it gets, until you hit the Nabataean strata, where the pottery turns redder, finer, and more deliberate. Mainstream historical fact: systematic archaeological work at Petra began in the early 20th century, but major excavations ramped up after the 1950s. Jordanian and international teams have since uncovered temples, tombs, irrigation systems, and over 1,000 domestic sites. Every trench brings something new even now. You stand and dust your knees, imagining those early explorers, sweating in pith helmets, sketching ruins by hand, hoping to catch a glimpse of lost history before the wind buried it again. They weren't always delicate, of course. Archaeology back then sometimes looked suspiciously like treasure hunting with better PR. A quirky tidbit: one 19th century traveler, convinced the treasury really did hide Pharaoh's gold, tried firing cannonballs at its urn to open it. It didn't work, unless you count the invention of permanent regret as a discovery. You grin, step around a cluster of dig equipment, and picture modern archaeologists instead, quiet, methodical, half-bent over their trenches, like detectives at a crime scene 2 millennia old. Their brushes flick with almost musical rhythm, soft strokes that make the sand sigh. A woman kneeling nearby might be recording soil color codes. A student gently lifts a potsherd into a labeled bag. Each find, no matter how small, adds a pixel to the ancient picture. And in Petra, that picture is vast. Historians still argue whether the Nabataeans were primarily traders who turned urban late, or a settled people who built a trade empire by design. The archaeological record doesn't make it easy. Pottery suggests long-term residence. Burial practices suggest nomadic roots. Their cities were both stable and flexible, like mirages that decided to stick around. You duck into a half-excavated structure where sunlight slants through a broken lintel. On one wall, faint traces of painted plaster cling to the stone, deep red, olive green, a hint of blue. Domestic wall painting, something most visitors never imagine existing here. Someone once painted their house, not with murals of gods or battles, but with color, simply because it pleased them. You imagine that person, maybe a merchant's wife, squinting at the wall in the same light that touches your face now. Archaeologists love details like that, the small reminders that ancient people weren't ancient to themselves. They were modern right then, as modern as you are now. juggling trade taxes, gossip, and the occasional water crisis. You wander out toward a site still fenced with rope. A small sign reads, "Excavation in progress." Beyond it, a trench reveals a room with amphorae lined neatly against one wall. Some are cracked, others whole. A graduate student told you once that the residue from one of these jars contained traces of frankincense and honey wine. A Nabataean happy hour immortalized in chemistry. You chuckle. Somewhere, someone probably invented the first hangover here. The sun climbs, and you take shelter under an awning beside a temporary lab tent. Inside, archaeologists are sorting finds, bones, beads, coins, and a lump of metal that once pretended to be a lamp. The hum of a generator mingles with the soft clink of tools. There's a rhythm to it, a heartbeat of discovery that never quite stops. An older researcher waves you over and shows you a tablet fragment, Nabataean script, deeply etched, the letters flowing right to left. She explains that translation remains tricky because the script evolved quickly and half the texts found are graffiti or ledger notes. It's like trying to reconstruct a civilization from shopping lists. She laughs. You nod, watching her brush dust from the inscription with reverence. That reverence is contagious. Petra teaches you that even the smallest scrap matters because time itself is stingy with survivors. Beyond the tents, the cliffs shimmer in the heat haze. For a moment, the facades seem to breathe as if they're alive again. You can almost see workers hauling water jars, camels resting in shade, children chasing each other across courtyards. The archaeologists might say you're imagining it, but you suspect that imagination is part of their job description too. A light joke comes to mind. You mutter, "Bet the ancient Nabataean kids still refused to clean their rooms." The wind seems to agree, carrying a faint chuckle across the valley. You keep walking, following a dirt track past trenches and tarps until you reach an overlook. From here, Petra stretches like an open book. You can see the city center, the royal tombs, the distant monastery perched high in the cliffs. You realize that every shovel stroke down there is a conversation between the living and the dead. You sit legs dangling over the edge and wonder what future archaeologists will find of us. Plastic shards, screen fragments, maybe a coffee cup buried under a collapsed skyscraper. They'll puzzle over our habits just as we puzzle over Nabataean ones. Historians still argue whether 21st century humans worshipped cats or merely filmed them constantly. You imagine them saying. You laugh quietly. The wind smells of stone and time. Far below, the team's voices echo faintly urgent, excited. Someone's found something new. You can't hear what, but you see movement. People gathering, cameras clicking. Maybe it's a coin. Maybe a tablet. Maybe another small miracle pulled from oblivion. You stand and watch the scene, heart strangely full. Because that's what archaeology really is, a gentle tug of war with time, and every tiny victory feels like rediscovering a heartbeat. You wake before dawn the next day, drawn by the low murmur of the dig camp coming to life. Coffee hisses on a portable burner, and a chorus of sleepy greetings ripples through the tents. The desert air still cool smells of dust, cardamom, and anticipation. Somewhere, a donkey brays a sound as old as the cliffs themselves. You stretch, shake the sand from your hair, and step outside. The sky is a gray to gold gradient, and Petra's facades glow faintly as if remembering yesterday's light. It feels like you're living inside an ancient lung, the city breathing time in and out. Today, you've been invited to see something strange, a find that doesn't quite fit the usual script. The lead archaeologist, a sunburned optimist with the kind of grin that usually precedes a big announcement, waves you over. "You'll like this one," he says. "It's weird. That's always the best word in archaeology." You follow him to a newly opened trench near the city's edge. The walls of the pit shimmer with layered soil, and at the bottom, partially exposed, lies what looks like a carved slab. Symbols swirl across its surface, spirals, dots, and faint Nabataean letters. But the style feels off, as if someone borrowed Nabataean grammar and decided to remix it. A mainstream historical fact, archaeologists have indeed found inscriptions in Petra that don't fit the neat categories of funerary, dedicatory, or commercial. Some blend Nabataean and early Arabic. Others borrow Greek letters or mysterious geometric forms. They hint that Petra was not only a trade hub, but also a crossroads of ideas. The archaeologist kneels, brushing away sand. "We're not sure if it's a star map or an accounting table," he admits. Historians still argue whether the Nabataeans tracked celestial routes for navigation or just used the stars as fancy decor. You tilt your head. "Maybe both," you say. "They had taste and curiosity." He laughs. "Exactly." A quirky tidbit: a few years ago, another dig uncovered a small bronze object shaped like a camel but with wings. Scholars still debate whether it was a child's toy, a votive charm, or proof that someone in Petra invented the fantasy genre 2,000 years early. You picture a Nabataean kid holding it up saying, "Look, Dad, it flies," and his father replying, "Son, if it's flying, you've probably had too much date wine." You crouch beside the slab and run your fingers near, but not on the carvings. The air here feels different, charged with that peculiar stillness that comes when something forgotten is almost remembered. Maybe it's a fragment of a lost script. Maybe it's a doodle. Maybe it's both. The sun breaks the horizon, washing the trench in gold. You watch the carved spirals catch the light like tiny mirrors. Further upslope, you see another team working at a collapsed temple site. They found something even odder, a stash of miniature altars hidden in a wall cavity. Each one's the size of a shoebox, perfectly shaped, as if designed for travel. "Portable shrines," someone murmurs. "Or maybe votive models for safe passage." You grin. So basically, ancient dashboard icons. The archaeologists laugh because it's not entirely wrong. The discovery sparks an argument about meaning. Some say the mini altars prove the Nabataeans practiced household or caravan devotion, not just public worship. Others think they were children's offerings or symbolic gifts to merchants embarking on long journeys. Historians still argue whether these finds mark private faith or clever marketing for temple priests. The debate feels endless, but in a good way. Petra's mysteries thrive on uncertainty. That's what keeps people digging. You wander away from the trenches toward a half-collapsed facade known locally as the Gin Block. The name alone sounds like an invitation to weirdness. These monolithic towers dot the approaches to Petra, featureless, imposing, carved from solid rock. No doorways, no inscriptions, just massive cubes standing guard. For decades, no one's agreed on their purpose. Tombs, boundary markers, altars, or something else entirely. You rest your palm against the stone and feel faint vibrations from the wind. There's a story here. You can sense it, but the rock isn't talking. A fringe theory claims the Jinn blocks weren't tombs at all, but astronomical markers aligned with solstices and star risings. You can't help picturing Nabataean priests climbing up here at midnight, charting constellations, trying to read the desert sky like scripture. Another theory, more recent, more cautious, suggests they were simple cenotaphs, memorials, without burials, meant to honor ancestors without disturbing the ground. Either way, the silence they keep feels intentional. You sit nearby, sipping water, letting the heat rise. The desert hums softly, flies the rustle of a distant tarp, the sigh of wind through cracks. It's not empty. It's just full of quiet. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, a modern drone buzzes faintly. Archaeologists mapping new routes with 3D scans. You smile at the irony, ancient precision studied by futuristic eyes. If the Nabataeans could see this, they'd probably charge the drone a toll. You think of all the fringe stories that swirl around Petra, lost treasure vaults, underground tunnels, secret libraries, even rumors that Moses once passed through here. The Bible's Rock of Horeb has been linked to these cliffs. Most of it is romantic nonsense, but there's a beauty in the nonsense too. Every myth, no matter how wild, testifies to the magnetic pull of this place. You imagine future archaeologists debating the finds of today's archaeologists, trying to guess why 21st century scientists brought plastic buckets to sacred ground. Historians still argue. They'll write whether the yellow helmets were ceremonial headgear or symbols of excavation cults. You laugh softly, startling a bird perched nearby. It flutters off, scattering dust like glitter. The archaeologist from earlier calls out, holding something up, a shard of pottery etched with a face. It's crude, but charming. A quick sketch of a bearded man with wide eyes and what might be a camel beside him. Folk art, someone exclaims, or caricature, another argues. You study it. Looks like a trader, you say, probably doodled during a slow market day. And just like that, the face becomes real. A merchant resting under an awning 2,000 years ago, idly scratching his reflection onto a pot before selling it for someone else's dinner. A joke immortalized in clay. That's the secret of these fringe finds. They may not rewrite textbooks, but they remind you that the past wasn't just grand, it was also weird, impulsive, and funny. The sun has climbed high now, and heat shimmers off every surface. You pull your scarf over your head and start walking back toward camp. Behind you, Petra hums with both certainty and doubt, each stone a fact, each shadow a theory. You whisper to yourself, the desert doesn't hide secrets. It just waits for better questions. By mid-afternoon, the wind picks up warm dry with a hiss that threads through your clothes and makes every fold of fabric whisper. You sit beneath a sun-bleached awning near the dig camp's edge notebook. Open. Staring at a map of caravan stops inked across the desert like freckles on an old hand. The dots stretch from Petra to Gaza to Damascus to Hegra, each a name with a story, each once alive with shouts, hoofbeats, and the sound of ledgers snapping shut. You're about to spend the day exploring the Nabataean world of money on the move. It's less dusty than tombs and temples, but no less fascinating. Beneath every rose-red cliff, there was always a deal being made, a mainstream historical fact to ground us. The Nabataeans were masters of finance in the 1st century BCE through the 1st century CE. They built their wealth not just by moving spices and incense, but by owning the routes, controlling tariffs, and offering credit to merchants who couldn't afford to move goods on their own. They were in effect the desert's first bankers-robed financiers who thought in caravans instead of columns of numbers. You imagine it, a caravan setting out from the port of Lukukomi, loaded with frankincense bound for Gaza. The merchant in charge didn't pay for all of it up front. He'd have taken a loan from a Nabataean financier, probably in Petra or Higra, who'd fronted the cost with an agreement that the profits would be split on arrival. Contracts were sealed not with a handshake, but with clay tablets, ink, and a word given under the eye of the gods. A quirky tidbit, some surviving Nabataean inscriptions show fragments of interest calculations, tiny scribbles, next to trade ledgers that seem to track repayment schedules. Imagine trying to do desert algebra without spreadsheets while your camel's chewing the corner of your papyrus. Historians still argue whether these early financial networks functioned as true banks or just family-based partnerships expanded across distance. The lines blur, as they often do when sand is involved. But one thing's clear: money here moved at the speed of trust. You sip water and look down the ridge toward the ruins of what might have been a storage quarter rows of rooms, their floors littered with broken amphorae and a few shards of Nabataean coinage. The coins, small and coppery, bear images of kings and camels, sometimes double-stamped, as if someone was reusing old currency when silver ran thin. They shimmer faintly in the sun, and for a moment you can almost hear their clink in a long-ago pouch. A voice from behind you, a Jordanian archaeologist with dust-streaked cheeks, leans over your shoulder. "We think this area was the Suq al-Kiraj," she says, "a marketplace for lending and profit sharing." She traces the air with her finger. "They'd loan you 3 camels worth of goods. You'd owe them 4 back in a season." You grin. So, ancient payday loans, but with more sand. She chuckles. And better margins. You follow her down into the excavation. At the base of a wall, she points out faint carvings, Nabataean letters arranged in tidy vertical lines. "We're still translating," she says, "but we think it's a ledger. Maybe a list of deliveries." It's humbling to imagine bookkeeping done in stone. Every line here mattered, each mark the difference between profit and ruin. And somewhere out there, along those camel trails, a whole web of credit existed without banks as we know them. Merchants carried clay tokens or inscribed tablets as promissory notes, proof of obligation or repayment. Some researchers suggest Nabataean caravans even used coded knots on cords, primitive receipts for goods transported. If true, it's basically the ancestor of your shipping label, just sweatier. The archaeologist tells you of one particularly strange: find a broken jug containing several small bronze rings, each stamped with a merchant's sigil. The rings don't fit on fingers. They were probably used as portable seals pressed into wax or clay to sign transactions. You imagine a trader checking his seal before sleep, making sure it's still tied to his belt. His entire reputation hanging from a piece of metal no bigger than a coin. Somewhere nearby, a breeze flips an old tarp, and fills the trench with a short burst of sand. You blink against it, and for a heartbeat, you see the past overlay the present. Petra's market square, alive again. Camels groaning scales, clinking voices bartering. A Nabataean money changer sits cross-legged beside a low table. In front of him are weights made of limestone perfectly balanced, and a bronze bowl for measuring silver. His clients, an Egyptian spice trader, a Greek sailor, and a local woman with a basket of myrrh, argue over rates, their words tumbling together in a storm of languages. The money changer stays calm, flicking one grain of sand from his scale. Behind him, an apprentice scribbles in shorthand. One mistake, and a caravan could vanish into debt. You blink again, and it's gone. Just dust stones and modern tools. But the echo lingers. Historians still argue whether the Nabataean economy depended more on taxation or on direct lending. Some scholars insist that Petra functioned primarily as a customs hub, taking a cut of passing goods. Others argue that the real genius lay in financing those journeys, earning quietly and visibly from interest rather than tolls. Either way, you suspect the Nabataeans would have thrived on today's stock market trading frankincense futures from a tent with excellent Wi-Fi. A small joke creeps into your mind. Imagine a Nabataean trader logging into Caravan Hub, calm to check his camel's location, shipment delayed sandstorm over Hegra. The day drifts into golden afternoon. The archaeologists pack up and you wander off toward an exposed stretch of ancient road. In the faint ruts, carved by centuries of hooves, you sense rhythm, steady, practical, relentless. Trade wasn't romantic to them, not really. It was math risk timing and trust. The desert punished bad accounting as swiftly as bad faith. You kneel and brush your fingers over the stone grooves. They're smoother than marble, polished by the passage of wealth itself. For a fleeting moment, you think of the thousands of promises carried across this land, the invisible web of IOUs that held empires together. Somewhere, perhaps still buried, lie the remains of a contract written in Nabataean script and sealed under the gaze of Dushara god of the high rock. Maybe it was paid in full, maybe not. The sun dips low, the ridges glow red again, and the wind smells faintly of something ancient and metallic, like coin dust and memory. You whisper into the dusk. In the desert, even trust had a price tag. The night air has cooled by the time you return to camp. Lanterns glow like captive stars, and the archaeologists huddle around steaming cups of tea. Someone passes you a mug, the mint leaves curling in the heat. You take a sip, feel the day's grit soften on your tongue, and glance out toward the dark outline of Petra's cliffs. Somewhere beyond those ridges lie the wells, the real heart of the caravan routes. You've walked enough desert to know that water is the true currency here. Gold buys camels. Camels carry goods, but without water, even kings crawl. A mainstream historical fact: the Nabataeans engineered one of the most advanced water management systems in the ancient world. Cisterns, aqueducts, covered channels, even hidden reservoirs, carved deep into rock, all designed to trap every drop of rainfall and morning dew. Archaeologists have mapped entire underground networks, feeding into communal wells and caravan stations. To this day, some still collect water after a storm. You decide to follow one of those channels in the morning. When dawn spills over the cliffs, you trace the path of a faint groove carved into sandstone. The channel slopes gently downhill, curving like handwriting, leading toward a shadowed basin. Inside, there's a well dry now, but still lined with smooth plaster, Nabataean craftsmanship, unmistakable. The stones seem to glow faintly, where centuries of hands once rested. You kneel beside the rim, peer into its darkness. It smells faintly of earth and time. Someone long ago hauled up water here, their rope biting grooves into the lip. Water meant life, but it also meant ownership. A quirky tidbit carved near one famous Petra cistern is a Nabataean inscription that reads roughly, "This water belongs to Obodaci, use and repay." It's essentially a desert IOU for hydration. Some wells were communal, others private, and still others shared through complex rotation agreements among clans. Historians still argue whether the Nabataean kings imposed centralized water control or whether local families maintained wells independently. The truth likely flowed somewhere in between. Authority, in layers like sediment, you picture the scene centuries ago, two caravans meeting at a desert oasis, their tents pitched at respectful distance. At dawn, both groups approach the well. Their leaders exchange formal greetings, words heavy with politeness, while everyone pretends not to eye the rope first. The rule was simple: share but keep count. Water diplomacy kept trade alive when politics might have failed. A clan that hoarded wells gained enemies. One that offered fair access gained partners. Many treaties carved in stone mention water rights alongside trade tolls and caravan safety. Without them, roots would have dissolved into feuds. You imagine the negotiations, sun beating down scribes, scratching into tablets, leaders speaking in slow, careful Nabataean. Maybe someone's goat bleated at the wrong moment, breaking the tension. Maybe everyone laughed, sealing a truce. A breeze sweeps through the canyon, scattering dust. You take that as your cue to move toward another feature, a row of stone basins along the cliff. Archaeologists call them settling tanks, filters for silt before the runoff reached storage cisterns. Some were covered with slabs, others open to the sky. Ingenious, really. You wonder if any of the Nabataeans ever bragged about their plumbing at dinner parties. The basins make you think of something else: how water shaped law. Unlike other ancient societies that codified land or livestock ownership, the Nabataeans appear to have codified flow. Some fragments of Nabataean legal text refer to right of draw, the permission to take a certain number of bucketfuls per day. The penalties for overuse, a fine, or in one humorous legend, temporary exile to the dry camp, a punishment no one wanted. You chuckle softly. Imagine ancient desert probation, you murmur. Survive a week without refilling your flask. Somewhere above, a hawk circles, watching you like an intruder in time. As the sun climbs, you reach another station. This one half collapsed, but still impressive. At its center, a carved trough runs 20 meters long, once used to water entire camel lines. The plaster remains smooth, still faintly pink under dust. You can almost hear the snorts, see the bubbles rise as thirsty mouths plunged in. A local guide joins you, carrying a tattered folder of site notes. This one, he says, tapping a page, was fed by two sources: rainwater from the cliffs and runoff from a hidden canal system. He grins. The Nabataeans wasted nothing. Even the morning fog got taxed. You smile. Taxed fog. That's dedication. He nods seriously. They said the gods gave water. We keep it safe. There's a spiritual side to this too. Many wells bore protective inscriptions invoking Dushara or Al-Uzza, asking for purity of water and safe passage for those who drank. A few even include small carved faces, guardians of the spring. The Nabataeans believed that water, being both precious and unpredictable, required divine oversight. You don't argue with that in a place where it rains twice a year. Historians still argue whether some of these sacred springs doubled as pilgrimage stops or simply as rest stations for the faithful. Either way, water blurred the line between resource and ritual. You scoop a handful of sand from the trough floor and let it fall through your fingers. It's cool in the shade, as if memory itself retains temperature. A strange thought crosses your mind. Maybe the true map of Nabataean civilization wasn't the network of roads, but of wells, each a node of cooperation, diplomacy, survival. Without them, the trade routes would have been dotted, not with prosperity, but with bones. You find one last cistern before sunset, a deep echoing chamber carved into the rock, its ceiling blackened from ancient torches. Inside, faint white crusts of salt cling to the walls. You whistle softly, and your voice bounces back ghostly. Someone once sang here, you're sure of it. Maybe to mark a journey's end. Maybe to test the echo. Maybe just to feel less alone. When you emerge again, twilight has fallen. The desert glows in pinks and purples, and the first stars peek out. You pour the last of your water into your cup, take a slow sip, and toast the invisible engineers of this landscape. To the ones who caught the rain before it ran away, you whisper. The wind answers with a faint sigh, cool and soft, as if approving your tribute. Morning again, thin light pouring through your tent flap like honey. You wake to the slow rhythm of the camp, stirring the soft thump of boots in sand, the clink of enamel mugs. A kettle whistles somewhere, and you breathe in steam scented with cardamom and dust. The archaeologists talk shop, in murmurs, their voices gentle after yesterday's long sun. Today, you're leaving the merchants and engineers behind. You're going looking for the people who rarely made it into the inscriptions, the women, the children, the families who move with the caravans but didn't make it into the chronicles. The desert hums differently when you imagine it full of voices like theirs. You follow a narrow goat path down from camp to a quiet wadi, where a few scattered stones hint at former dwellings, simple shelters of stacked rock and reed. It doesn't look like much, but the archaeologists say these small enclosures often marked caravan rest families, small units who lived semi-permanently along the routes, maintaining wells, tending animals, or selling provisions. A mainstream historical fact, Nabataean women held significant legal and economic status compared with their counterparts in neighboring cultures. Inscriptions record female property owners, business partners, and even priestesses. One woman named Abgaru appears in multiple graffiti near Petra. She owned land and financed caravans. It's not hard to imagine her standing here, overseeing both trade and household veil-fluttering voice, sharp as desert glass. You picture her now, scolding her son for carving his initials into a storage jar. You think I'm paying for new amphorae every week? A quirky tidbit: archaeologists once found a Nabataean cosmetic palette still smeared with red ochre pigment. Inside its case was a tiny bronze spoon and mirror fragment, practical yet elegant. The Nabataeans, it turns out, care deeply about presentation, even in the desert. Imagine trying to apply eyeliner with a sandstorm brewing. Historians still argue whether the frequent female names on Nabataean tombs mean genuine equality or simply high visibility among elite families. But the pattern suggests a world where women weren't confined to the home they ran it often, literally. You step deeper into the ruins. A faint path leads toward what may have been an animal enclosure. Around it lie scattered beads, agate shell, maybe glass. Someone's jewelry box, once overturned here. You crouch, brush the sand away, and imagine a caravan mother threading beads through her daughter's hair. Before dawn, whispering stories of the gods, of safe travel, of home that always moves. A camel bell jingles somewhere in memory. You start walking again, tracing the ghost of a trade route. In the distance, a group of locals, Bedouin families, guide their camels along the same path. The echo of continuity strikes you different centuries, same cadence. The desert keeps its habits. You catch up with one of the guides, a woman named Salma. Her scarf patterned in rose and white, like Petra's cliffs. "We grew up in the dunes," she says, smiling. "The wind teaches you patience." She gestures to her teenage daughter walking beside a camel. She knows how to find a well just by reading the air. "My grandmother taught me that." It hits you how skills like that, unrecorded and unwritten, formed the backbone of every caravan's success. The unsung logistics of mothers and daughters measuring wind and shadow. The archaeologists nearby joke about ancient supply chains. You grin. Guess who managed the actual chain? At midday, the heat turns silvery. You find shade beneath a rock ledge and pull out your notebook. The silence is dense here, full of hums and memories. You imagine a caravan family's rhythm: dawn chores, tending camels, cooking lentils, trading gossip about weather and routes. Kids chasing each other through dunes, kicking up clouds of laughter. One ancient graffito, found near a caravanserai, even records what might be a child's scribble: random Nabataean letters scattered across a wall, half backward. Someone learning to write while their parents traded frankincense outside. Maybe their name was lost, but their doodles still cling to the stone like fingerprints. You can't help but smile. The past, for all its grandeur, still had homework. Historians still argue whether these families traveled together as permanent groups or joined caravans seasonally. Some evidence points to mixed arrangements: long-term merchants who kept relatives in Petra or Hegra, while traveling with hired crews, and smaller families who lived along the routes full-time, maintaining the lifeblood of through familiarity with the terrain. You look up at the cliffs around you, streaked red and gold. Somewhere among these folds might have been a home, temporary yet steady, marked not by stone foundations, but by repetition, pitching the same tent on the same patch of sand, generation after generation. A light breeze rises, and with it comes a faint scent of smoke. Someone's cooking fire nearby. You wander toward it and find a group of archaeologists sharing a simple meal with Bedouin locals, flatbread olives, and goat stew. They wave you over. The air smells of cumin and laughter. You sit accept a plate and realize that this breaking bread under a desert sky hasn't changed much in 2,000 years. You imagine the Nabataean equivalent travelers and families gathered around a communal fire, comparing stories of storms, lost cargo, and found wells. Somewhere in the circle, a grandmother tells tales of Dushara's mountain throne, while a child sneaks an extra date from the pot. The fire pops, stars glimmer, and everyone feels just safe enough to sleep. A quirky image crosses your mind. Maybe one of those children grew up to carve the treasury's facade, chiseling by day, humming the same lullaby his mother once sang by a roadside fire. You sip water and let the thought linger. Families aren't just bloodlines, they're memory engines. Even the most silent ruins carry echoes of lullabies. As twilight falls, you stand and stretch. The cliffs deepen to violet, and the first stars rise faint but familiar. Somewhere you think a Nabataean child once counted those same stars before sleep, whispering each name as a promise of return. The desert grows hushed again, the wind slipping between rocks like a lullaby itself. You close your notebook and whisper to the night. They kept the caravans moving, but they also kept the stories alive. And the sand, as if in agreement, glimmers faintly under the moon. The next morning, the desert feels quieter. Even the camels seem subdued, their shadows long and still in the slanting light. You pack your things slowly, feeling that subtle melancholy that comes near the end of a long journey. The awareness that time, like sand, keeps flowing whether you hold it or not. Today's trail leads you toward the old roads that used to matter, the forgotten arteries of the Nabataean network, now buried, bent, or stolen by new empires. You're about to walk through the slow heartbreak of decline, though it doesn't feel tragic, more like a graceful exhale after centuries of holding breath. A mainstream historical fact, the Nabataean kingdom was annexed by Rome in 106 CE under Emperor Trajan, becoming the province of Arabia Petraea. On the surface, it was a peaceful takeover. The Nabataeans didn't fall with fire and sword, they simply merged into something larger. But the new Roman trade routes paved and redirected toward Mediterranean ports slowly strangled the old caravan paths. Commerce changed shape. The desert began to empty. You follow the faint outline of one such abandoned road, a cracked, uneven line of stones half swallowed by sand. Every few meters, a toppled milestone still peeks through its Latin inscription barely visible. Once caravans clattered through here, now even lizards pause puzzled by your footsteps. The silence feels heavier than usual. You pause beside a ruined watchtower, its staircase eaten by erosion. The air smells faintly of ash and sagebrush. A shepherd's ghost, maybe. You climb what's left and gaze out. From here, you can see the distant shimmer of a Roman fort squared geometry imposed on fluid land. The empire's handwriting is unmistakable. Historians still argue whether the Nabataeans willingly accepted Roman governance for stability or were slowly pressured by economic dependency. Either way, the transition was less invasion, more absorption, a gradual redirection of profit streams. a quiet bureaucratic victory. You imagine a Nabataean trader in that first generation after annexation. Same roots, same camels, but new taxes, new rulers, and a creeping sense that the game had changed. The Roman, via Nova Traiana, bypassed some traditional stops, diverting caravans straight to ports under imperial control. Wells dried, not because the rain stopped, but because the people moved elsewhere. A quirky tidbit: archaeologists have found Roman coins in Petra bearing Emperor Trajan's face, but scratched with Nabataean letters spelling obotus, perhaps a quiet act of defiance, or maybe nostalgia carved into currency. Even rebellion, it seems, can be polite when your tools are chisels. You keep walking. The path drops into a valley where the ground crunches underfoot, with fragments of pottery, red Nabataean ware, mingled with duller Roman shards. You crouch and pick one up, turning it between your fingers. It's thin, beautifully made, the hallmark of Petra's artisanship. The Nabataeans perfected pottery that was nearly translucent, fired at low temperatures, smooth as eggshell. This shard, though, feels tired. Maybe it was one of the last made before the kilns went cold. The wind rises carrying a fine veil of sand over your boots. You think of trade routes like veins and how this one, once throbbing with wealth, has gone still. The empires that depended on these lines found new lifeblood elsewhere: ships instead of saddles, harbors instead of wells. Still, decline doesn't mean disappearance. Many Nabataean families adapted, blending into Roman life, becoming tax collectors, caravan brokers, even soldiers. Their script evolved into early Arabic forms. Their gods found new names. Culture rarely dies, it repaints itself. Up ahead, the valley opens into a broad plain, where the ruins of an ancient caravanserai sit half buried. You step inside its courtyard. The walls are knee-high, but their symmetry still whispers of design: stalls for camels along one side, a hearth in the center, an alcove for prayer facing the sunrise. You stand in the middle and close your eyes. For a second, you can hear it: the distant shuffle of hooves, laughter, metal cups clinking. Then it's gone again, replaced by wind. Historians still argue whether climate change played a role in the decline. Some studies suggest a long drought around the 3rd century CE reduced rainfall, crippling agriculture and water supplies. Others think political shifts, new maritime routes from Yemen to the Red Sea, did most of the damage. You decide not to choose sides. The desert, after all, has always preferred multiple answers. A shadow crosses overhead, a falcon gliding on thermals, scanning the same landscape that once swarmed with life. You watch it bank eastward toward the mountains. Still patrolling the old roads, you whisper. You climb a nearby ridge as the light shifts toward afternoon. The horizon stretches vast and empty. But then you notice something: a narrow track, gleaming faintly in the distance, still used by local herders. The ancient path survives, repurposed. Maybe that's the lesson here: trade dies, but routes don't. They wait for someone else to need them. You take a seat on a boulder. Let the silence sink in. There's a strange peace in ruins like these, not loss exactly, but release. The Nabataeans built for eternity, but they also understood impermanence. You can see it in their water systems, designed not to fight the desert, but to flow with it. Even their decline feels organic, as if the land simply asked for quiet again. A quirky image surfaces in your mind, some long-retired Nabataean merchant, now gray-bearded, and living in a Romanized town, sitting by his doorway, watching the sea muttering, "These ships, I tell you, they don't even smell of camels anymore." You laugh softly at your own thought, but it rings true. Progress always leaves nostalgia in its wake. The sun dips lower. Shadows pool inside the caravanserai's remains. You walk back to the doorway, run your hand along the stone. The wall feels warm, smooth from centuries of sand polish. You can almost believe it remembers faces, the thousands who rested here, prayed here, argued here, and moved on. You take one last look across the plain. Somewhere beneath the sand, coins still glint, clay, tablets crumble, and wells wait for the sound of rope again. The desert keeps its archives differently. No shelves, no ink, just silence and patience. As you turn to leave, the wind shifts, and for a heartbeat, you smell something sweet on the air, like incense, faint but real. Maybe it's just your imagination. Or maybe it's the desert's way of saying that nothing truly vanishes. It only changes direction. You smile into the wind and murmur, "The caravans may be gone, but the road still dreams of them." Night edges back across the horizon, a bruised violet deepening into indigo. You move slower now, tracing the last veins of the Nabataean world, not the bustling trade or the clinking of amphorae, but the quiet after-image of what remains. Tonight, it's about legacy, how a people who carved warehouses into rose cliffs managed to carve themselves into memory too. You find yourself walking through the narrow gorge, again the sick of Petra. Its walls glow faintly in the starlight, smooth like old skin. Every groove, every chisel mark feels like handwriting. The Nabataeans may have left no grand chronicles or marble inscriptions proclaiming their greatness, yet their architecture is their autobiography. Each curve of rock, a sentence, each facade, a paragraph. A mainstream historical fact. Much of our modern knowledge about trade in the ancient Near East, roots goods, even diplomacy, comes indirectly from what the Nabataeans left behind. Archaeologists studying caravan trails from Petra to Gaza and Damascus have reconstructed entire trade economies using the faintest clues: coin, hoards, pottery stamps, fragments of graffiti in Nabataean script. The Nabataeans never wrote epic histories, but their logistics now, that's their poetry. You pause beneath a carving of a weathered god, his features nearly gone. The wind moans softly through a crack above, and for a strange moment it sounds like breath. Still watching over the shipments, you murmur, "Maybe he is." Or maybe it's just the wind being nostalgic. Historians still argue whether the Nabataeans' influence on later Arabic culture was linguistic, architectural, or purely symbolic. Some say their script directly evolved into early Arabic letters. Others think the connection is looser, like cousins who shared a desert long ago. Either way, their language didn't vanish. It adapted, reshaped itself to new sounds, new empires, new prayers. You brush your fingers along a Nabataean inscription etched low on the wall. It's not Latin, not Greek, just those distinctive loops and curls. Someone once took the time to scratch this into stone, probably a trader marking his stopover. The translation scholars say is something like "safe journey to all who pass here." You smile, a universal sentiment carved 2,000 years ago and still valid tonight. A quirky tidbit: one archaeologist in the 1980s found a single olive pit in the floor of Petra's great temple and traced its genetic line back to a type still grown in Jordan today, meaning that a modern olive tree could literally be the descendant of Nabataean orchards. You can't help imagining the pit falling from someone's hand, rolling into a crack, and then centuries later sprouting anew, a living continuity. Legacy hides in unexpected places. You reach the treasury facade, that impossibly intricate cliff carving everyone knows from postcards and movies. But in the moonlight, it doesn't look cinematic. It looks personal. The columns shimmer pale gold, the niches deep as dreams. You tilt your head back and imagine the artisans who made it suspended from ropes, tapping away with bronze tools for years. Not just architects, but storytellers working in geology instead of ink. And somehow, their story still speaks. Tourists photograph it. Historians decode it. YouTubers like you maybe whisper about it at bedtime. Every retelling is a new translation of the same melody. Historians still argue whether Petra's wealth came mainly from trade tolls, direct exchange, or the control of water sources that forced caravans to pay for access. The answer may never be singular. But what's clear is that the Nabataeans turned geography into art. They didn't just survive the desert, they curated it. As you leave the treasury behind, the path widens into the street of facades. Hundreds of tombs stare down like quiet spectators. You feel their gaze, not eerie, more like a crowd of patient ancestors. The air smells faintly of dust and time. Somewhere nearby, a small spring still trickles. You crouch by it, cup your hands, and taste the water. It's cool, almost metallic. The same water, perhaps, that once filled camel skins, that cooled jars of frankincense, that soaked weary feet. The continuity hums through your palms. You think of modern archaeologists hiking this same ground with LiDAR scanners and drones mapping routes invisible to the naked eye. Digital ghosts chasing ancient footprints. The Nabataean legacy is now lines of code preserved in datasets and museum archives. Yet even technology bows to the same awe, the sense that beneath every dataset lies a heartbeat carved in stone. You recall that some Nabataean words survive in Arabic place names today: Ain for spring, Wadi for valley, for mother. Language keeps memory alive by hiding it in plain sight. A tourist might drive past Wadi Musa without realizing it means the Valley of Moses, a place where biblical echoes blend with Nabataean engineering. A breeze picks up, carrying a faint smell of juniper. Somewhere in the cliffs above, a fox yips. You smile. Life goes on even here. The road you're on now connects to newer paths, asphalt highways, tourist buses, academic field camps. The same geography, different travelers. And yet beneath it all, the pulse of the old trade still thrums faintly. Every photo posted, every documentary narrated, every archaeologist's notebook is another caravan in the long journey of remembrance. A quirky observation: one scholar joked that the Nabataeans are the only ancient people whose tourist industry is bigger now than in their own time. You chuckle softly at that, though it's true. Every visitor adds a coin to their afterlife economy. As you wander past the last tombs, the desert opens wide again. The stars are brighter than they have any right to be. You lie down on a flat rock, arms behind your head, watching the constellations drift. Orion hangs over the cliffs like a celestial caravan leader. You trace his belt, then follow an imaginary line toward the horizon where the old incense road once ran. Somewhere out there, the dust of the Nabataeans mingles with Roman glass, Egyptian gold, and Arabian myrrh, an invisible museum spanning miles. You think of how fragile yet durable legacy is, a mixture of intention and accident. They didn't plan for us to remember them this way, but we do. Historians still argue whether memory itself is a kind of artifact, whether the act of remembering transforms history into myth. You decide. It doesn't matter. The important part is that the story endures, and the story always finds new storytellers. You close your eyes and whisper, "The rose-red city, half as old as time." The words echo faintly against the stone, as if the cliffs are repeating them for themselves. Legacy, you realize, isn't a monument. It's an echo that refuses to fade. The night is still, now utterly still. The stars burn steady over the cliffs as if nailed to the sky. You stand at the edge of Petra's great basin, where the stone city opens like a bowl into the desert, the air so clear that the Milky Way looks almost close enough to dip your fingers in. The warehouses sleep behind you, those rose-red chambers that once throbbed with camel bells' laughter and the slap of sandals on sandstone floors. You breathe in deeply, feeling the weight of everything that has passed through here: incense and silk stories and prayers, ambitions and arguments. This was once the hub of the world's perfume, the road of aromas, the trail of trade that stitched together Yemen's hills, Judea's markets, and Rome's marble halls. And now it's silent, a perfect museum of wind and shadow. You take one slow step forward, listening to the crunch beneath your boot. Somewhere, under that thin crust of sand, Nabataean jars still sleep, sealed with wax that hardened before the Gospels were written. Pottery jewelry, camel harness buckles, the leftover syllables of an extinct language of trade. Archaeologists say there's still more buried here than has ever been found. Whole neighborhoods, perhaps still locked under the sediment of centuries. Historians still argue whether the Nabataeans saw themselves as desert nomads who learned to build, or city folk who remembered how to wander. Both versions fit. They were never about one place. They were about connection. Every road they carved, every cistern they built, every mark they left was an invitation to cross, to meet, to share. A mainstream historical fact, the Nabataean control of the incense roots helped shape not just commerce, but religion itself. Those same spices, frankincense, myrrh, would later flavor sacred rituals from Jerusalem to Rome. Their trade sustained temples, and empires financed kings, perfumed gods. Even today, when incense curls upward in cathedrals or mosques, it's whispering in the same language of smoke the Nabataeans spoke. A quirky tidbit: one excavated tomb near Petra's outskirts contained a stash of glass beads from India, a lump of African ivory, and a single Roman bronze coin, with a hole drilled neatly through it. apparently worn as jewelry. Whoever that person was, they carried half the world in their pocket. You picture that now. Someone standing way here long ago, maybe at dawn, holding those beads, watching the first light slide across the cliffs. It's comforting to think that even across millennia, humans have always paused to marvel at sunrise. You wander toward one of the old water channels, a narrow groove cut with exquisite precision. The engineers who made it thought like poets working with gravity listening to stone. You crouch down and run your fingers along its smooth path. Even dry, it feels alive, as if the memory of running water still hums through it. You follow it for a while until it disappears into a cliffside tunnel. Inside, the air is cool and smells faintly of dust and minerals. You whisper something, anything just to hear the echo. The rock answers soft but distinct, repeating your words as if reluctant to let them go. Outside again, the wind has picked up a little. It carries the desert's familiar perfume, juniper salt, and old dreams. You look up at the cliff walls, their faces glowing faintly pink, even by starlight, and realize that the entire city feels like it's breathing with you. Every inhalation pulls in history. Every exhalation releases it. You think about how the Nabataeans, like the stars above, never truly disappeared. Their roads became the skeleton of later empires. Their methods of water management are still studied by modern engineers in Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Their artistry shaped the vocabulary of desert architecture. Their patience, the quiet, meticulous patience of a people who could wait a decade for a single cistern to fill, remains one of the world's rarest lessons. You find a flat rock, sit down, and just listen. For once, no footsteps, no murmuring tourists, no guides rehearsing their scripts. Only you and the night and the small comfort that you've walked a few hours in the footprints of those who made this landscape human. Historians still argue whether Petra was ever truly abandoned or if it simply faded, transforming into a settlement of shepherds and monks. But standing here, it doesn't feel abandoned at all. It feels like a city that learned to dream quietly content to outlast everything. A shooting star slices across the horizon. You grin despite yourself. All right, you whisper. I'll take that as a sign. Maybe of closure. Maybe of continuity. Your gaze drifts toward the distant desert where faint lights shimmer. The modern highway. Cars moving like new caravans, their headlights echoing the old lantern glow. You can't help but think the trade never stopped. It just changed its vehicles. The Nabataeans would probably laugh at the idea that we're still hauling goods across deserts, just faster, noisier, with air conditioning. You stretch your legs, your body pleasantly tired, your mind thick with history. There's a calm kind of satisfaction in realizing that for all our satellites and smartphones, we're still just travelers looking for water warmth and a story to bring home. The stars pulse brighter, like embers breathing. You lean back against the stone, close your eyes, and let the night cradle you. And now, let's slow everything down. The night here doesn't end sharply. It fades tenderly, like ink soaking into old parchment. The wind softens to a murmur, curling through the canyons, touching the carved columns one last time before slipping away. You let your breath fall into rhythm with it, slow, in slower, out until your heartbeat feels like part of the landscape. The warehouses behind you fade into silhouettes, their edges melting into starlight. You can almost hear the ghosts of old caravans again, not loud now, just gentle footfalls brushing sand. Maybe they're still walking, circling endlessly through memory camels, carrying nothing but stories, merchants whispering in languages that sound like lullabies. Every stone, every echo, every shadow here reminds you that time doesn't erase, it layers. The Nabataeans may have gone, but their lines remain etched into rock, into road, into how the desert itself breathes. You lie back and feel the cool air settle against your skin. Somewhere far off, a nightbird calls once, then falls silent. The constellations lean close, patient, ancient kind. So you close your eyes. The desert hums softly around you, a low cradle song of sand and memory. And as you drift towards sleep, you realize you've been part of the same long story, all along the story of travelers, dreamers, and builders who dared to make something lasting out of dust. Sweet dreams, traveler. May your road always find its well, your night always find its quiet.